What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Lights Out. I'm your host, Josh.
And I'm your host, Austin.
And I'm the producer, Daniel.
And Danny is back this week, feeling much better.
Much better.
Happy to have you for this beefy episode we've got today. We're going to be diving into the Texas killing fields case. I mean, this case is monstrous and could probably have 30 hours if you really dug into every single case. Attached to sort of this larger case that is known now as the Texas killing fields. This is truly a haunting one, a disturbing one, and one that will probably make you feel very frustrated, if not pissed off, at just the absolute incompetence surrounding the early investigations of some of these victims. I mean, it is just appalling. And although, not that surprising, especially when we're talking about the 70s, 80s,
right?
Police work was just not very good, especially in smaller towns.
Yeah, things weren't digitized. We weren't really sharing information as efficiently as we could have. But yeah, even giving them that benefit of the doubt, though, it's still pretty terrible.
Yeah, there's a lot of
much failure.
There's a lot of very basic things like preserving evidence, securing crime scenes that could have really helped solve a lot of these unsolved murders. So if you're not familiar with the Texas killing fields, it's the stretch of Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston, Texas, and there have been more than 30 bodies discovered since going all the way back to the 1970s. But this is an absolutely massive case, and we really tried to condense as much of it as we possibly could to have it make sense for you, because there's so many different cases that have their own stories. But we're going to tell you kind of how this whole thing came about, the origins of it, and the 4 young women that were murdered that really kind of started this whole thing at the very beginning. And there's so many other victims that we won't be able to get to, because again, there's 30 plus victims here, all of them being women, and some of them being as young as 12. Actually, most of them being between the ages of 12 and 25. There's some older victims there as well, but it's definitely a haunting one that I wish had more coverage. And it seems like there's a good chance a lot of these cases may not get solved for various different reasons, which we'll discuss. But if you're not familiar, the Texas killing fields is an area near Interstate Highway 45 between Houston and Galveston, Texas, which more than 30 bodies have been discovered since the early 1970s. I think the exact number many people who research this case kind of come back to is 33 different murders. And this has been going on since the early 1970s. But the most notorious area within the killing fields is a 25-acre piece of land often called the Calder Road Fields in League City, Texas, where the bodies of 4 women were found between 1983 and 1991. Like I said, many of the victims were mainly girls or young women, and many more have disappeared from the I-45 area and are still missing to this day. Almost all of the victims of the Texas killing fields were between the ages of 12 and 25, and very few of these murders and disappearances have ever been solved, even with the help of several local police departments. I mean, they've got Harris County Sheriff's Department, the local municipal departments, and even the FBI getting involved, because obviously there's some type of serial killer operating in this area, and potentially more than just one. And so anytime a case starts, having this many victims, and it seems like they could be connected, the FBI is going to get involved. But it's still been very, very difficult to kind of tie these cases together and figure out who is behind all of these murders. But the area has often been described as the perfect place for killing someone and getting away with it. A victim's father named Tim Miller, he's a very integral part of this whole case and investigation. But he has even said that if you screamed at the top of your lungs in the Calder Fields area, which is right off I-45, nobody would be able to hear you. And he even went out there and fired off 5 or 6 shots from his gun, seeing if anybody would call the police and show up. And nobody ever did. So that tells you a lot. I mean, obviously there's a lot of road noise from the highway there. It's also very rural. It's, it's not like there's tons of lighting, especially when we talk about the time period a lot of these murders took place. I think now today it's a little bit more developed. Obviously, these places are growing in population, and I think there's more suburbs and subdivisions and commercial buildings, things like that. But back in the 70s, 80s, there was nothing.
Yeah. And I think around this specific field that we're talking about was at the time just developed, really, like in the surrounding areas. Those were like fresh, new suburban neighborhoods.
Right. So not only is this area very remote, but from the sites of some of the recovered bodies, the refineries at the south end of the city and the traffic of I-45 make plenty of noise that could drown out the sounds of an attack. The director of the film, Texas Killing Fields, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, Ami Cannon Mann, visited the area and said, if you yelled, no one would necessarily hear you, and if you ran, there wouldn't necessarily be anywhere to go. So traveling on I-45 south out of Houston, the area is a mix of dense suburban neighborhoods, and it continues into open, sprawling fields, bayous, and retention ponds. The petrochemical plants operate near the coastline, and the further south you go, old oil fields and desolate marshes fill the areas between Houston and Galveston. Although the population has boomed in the area, there are still plenty of places that are still very remote to this day. And to make these cases even more challenging to investigate, as you can imagine, and we all know, this area gets hit by hurricanes quite often, especially in the southern coastal region of Texas. On top of all the devastating damage that they cause to the local communities there's no way to know how much damage these storms have caused to potential crime scenes, evidence, and the remains of victims. This on top of the South Texas heat, which, as many of you know who live there, it reaches into the 110s almost daily, especially in the summertime, has left many of the victims' remains completely skeletal when discovered, with most of the DNA completely just washed away. So to set the scene, in the 1970s, Houston, Texas was on the rise. The NASA Space Center drew a lot of attention, and an oil boom drove the local economy, so tons of people were moving into the area for jobs. Exxon was building some of the biggest refineries in the entire world in this area. This economic boom drew in countless people, causing suburbs, shopping centers, and tourist spots to expand at a rapid pace. Houston began drawing in thousands of visitors looking for fun in the big city, including two 15-year-old girls, Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, and they would become some of the Texas Killing Fields' earliest victims. Debbie was a champion water skier, and they both loved the beach and surfing. And they were last seen on November 15, 1971, attempting to hitchhike to Houston. They were spotted in an island ice cream shop in Galveston before vanishing. And only 2 days later, on November 17, 1971, their bodies were discovered, partially nude in a bayou near Texas City. Witnesses claim they saw a man in a white van stopping by a curb to pick up the girls after he agreed to drive them up to Houston. Less than 2 weeks later, the remains of 13-year-old Colette Wilson were discovered near Addicks Reservoir, 10 miles west of Houston, and she was last seen at the Alvin bus stop on County Road 99 and Highway 6 in Alvin, Texas. Her band director had dropped her off on June 17, 1971, and only 3 days earlier, the remains of 19-year-old Gloria Gonzalez had been found in the same reservoir. And many, many, many more victims would disappear along Interstate 45, including 14-year-old Brenda Jones. She was last seen walking to Galveston Hospital, and her body was discovered on July 2nd, 1971, floating in the nearby Galveston Bay, not far from the interstate highway. And unfortunately at the time, not many of these disappearances and suspected murders were under heavy media spotlight. The real national pressure wouldn't arrive until the 1980s, when many more victims began disappearing. And that is always so wild to me. You know, obviously I don't know what that time was like or what was really even going on in the media, but the fact that all these girls are disappearing and then turning up dead, and yet there's very little media coverage. And the whole thought process back then was like the runaways, or, you know, there was always an excuse for why something bad happened to them. It seems like, not always, but in most cases they would be like, well, so-and-so, you know, she was a bad kid, she ran away, or she hung out with the wrong people, so kind of makes sense what happened to her. And then it just kind of ended.
And we'll see the police departments will do the same thing for future victims, where it'll be like, oh, this victim was hanging out with the wrong people. This victim was a runaway. This victim they would always categorize them in a certain way. This one was a cocktail waitress, hanging out at bars, so that the public would kind of shrug and be like, oh, because they love to form this social totem pole where we can accept when a person at the bottom of this fabricated social totem pole disappears, right? And so the police is like, oh, we relinquish kind of our duty when it's kind of an unfavorable victim, so to speak, in their eyes. And we'll see this time and again through a lot of these victims that they'll just, oh, well, she was hanging out with the wrong crowd. She was a drug addict. So why bother? As if they're more or less human than anybody else,
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, this still happens today too.
Still happens.
I don't want to make it sound like this was only happening in the 70s, 80s. I mean, this happens all the time now, which is just crazy to me that there's still this mindset in a lot of police departments that, there's people worth looking for, and then there's people that aren't, or, it's just very dependent upon, all these different factors. And it's insane that, we're not all treated equal. We're not all, we're still not all the same in the eyes of law and law enforcement. And it's very sad, because if that weren't the case, a lot of these would have been solved very quickly.
Yep.
And they wouldn't still be cold cases to this day.
Yeah. And we'll see, like, a lot of the media attention will only explode when a certain victim kind of disappears.
Yeah. And you'll be like, of course,
right? Yeah. It's still a problem to this day. You remember the Willie Picton case?
Yeah.
I always think of that one because I think that one defines how, like, this social totem pole that we've established, where it's like, and he knew that, which is why he picked his victims the way they did, because he's like, the police aren't looking for these people, so I can just pick them off.
They prey on the most vulnerable. Yeah.
So a specific area we're going to be talking about is a 25-acre area at the south end of Leak City, south of I-45, and it's known as the Calder Road Fields, sometimes called the Calder Drive Fields. It's an unsuspecting piece of land originally owned by a petrochemical company that sat mostly empty for years. The only thing there was, it was like a horse trail ride business, and then there was a main road, and this main road was Calder Drive, which is a single dirt road with a dead end. I think it's paved now, but at the time it was a dirt road. In the 1980s, this area and the horrific activity within it would soon overwhelm the surrounding communities and the local police.
Which I'm curious, if anybody lives in League City that's out there listening, I'd be really interested to hear at what extent that they still talk about these cases to this day. And if you see any billboards referencing some of these cold cases, or if anybody even talks about the Texas killing fields anymore, I'd be curious to hear from you.
Yeah. Seems like the cases have had a resurgence in the past few years.
Yeah.
For more reasons than one, but.
Spark something uncommon this holiday with just the right gift from Uncommon Goods. The busy holiday season is here, and my anxiety is at an all-time high. Stress is running right up there as well, because you got to start shopping for gifts for all your loved ones, your friends. I struggle every single year. Uncommon Goods is the best place to find the perfect gift for that person on your list. You can scroll on this website for hours because they have gifts for literally everybody, no matter the interest. They've got you covered. They've got jewelry. They've got home decor. They got kitchen and bar, stuff for your kids, men, women, interests. They even have it broken down by. And I guarantee you spend a few minutes on here and you're going to have way too many ideas of what to get for everybody on your list. I mean, just looking at it today, they have a video game set, create your own, which is really cool. It's like a Game Boy looking handheld, and you can actually create your own video game set with that. They also have this cool kids digital camera, which I'm definitely picking up for my daughter. She's been all about cameras lately. Instead of using a phone, I'll give her own little digital camera. But I mean, they have they have like a root beer science kit. You can make your own root beer. They have tons of those cool gifts that are, actually, it's not just taken out of the box and they're like, oh, thank you, but you actually get to make it. Stuff is handmade. The jewelry is really cool. and they work with a ton of different independent artists. And I mean, some of this stuff looks straight up homemade. So not only are you finding great gifts, but you're also supporting artists and small independent businesses with Uncommon Goods, which is really cool. Uncommon Goods looks for products that are high quality, unique, and often handmade in the United States. I love this as well. With every purchase you make at Uncommon Goods, they give back $1 to a nonprofit partner of your choice. And they've donated more than $3 million to date. So what's not to love? To get 15% off your next gift, go to uncommongoods.com/lightsout. That's uncommongoods.com/lightsout for 15% off. Don't miss out on this limited time offer. Uncommon Goods, we're all out of the ordinary.
Yeah, so in this area, the first victim was discovered at the Calder Road fields by a neighborhood dog on April 6, 1984. So the dog was with this neighborhood boy, and the dog kind of bolts off into the woods. It came back with a human skull between its jaws. Soon after, a set of human remains belonging to a local woman, a 25-year-old bartender at the Texas Moon named Heidi Fye, were discovered underneath a nearby tree. So her friends called her Heidi Fye, that's how we'll be calling her, or
and
just Heidi.
How it's spelled too.
Yeah.
Right.
But sometimes if you watch some documentaries about the case, Heidi's family, they called her Heidi. It was just like kind of their nickname for her, but we'll just be calling her Heidi. So 6 months before the discovery of her remains, she had gone missing on October 7th, 1983. She was on her way to Houston to a house that her boyfriend had been fixing up. They were going to move a trailer from his property into Heidi's mother's backyard and stay there to save up some money. But Heidi never arrived in Houston. She was actually last seen by a clerk at a convenience store payphone located off West Main Street and Hobbs in League City, Texas. When the family contacted League City police, like we were saying, they brushed it off. They told the family she was probably just a runaway. They recommended that the family wait a few days, and you know what? Heidi would eventually come back. They also told the family to hold off on putting any missing posters out or contacting the media.
So they're so sure of themselves that she ran away that they're like, don't even bother looking for her at this point.
That's it's crazy to say one thing like she's just a runaway, but then to tell to advise the family to be like, don't contact media or put out posters yet. Like, just calm down, go home.
Yeah, it's insanity because you know her family is like, this is not like her. Right. She would not just run away.
Yeah.
And so they're hearing this from the family, and despite that are like, oh, don't worry. Like overriding what the family believes is going on.
Yep.
And negating the whole fact that something horrible just happened to her, and we should probably respond to it and try to get to her before it's too late. It's insane to me that this happens. It's crazy.
And this will happen time and again. And on top of that, they'll quickly be like, oh, well, you know, she was a cocktail waitress at a bar. Probably came across
what the fuck does that have to do with anything?
Right.
Like,
yep. Which is how the media will also portray her at the time. That's like, oh, she's a cocktail waitress. She's hanging out with some seedy people at a bar. That's why. Like,
and
she
has a job.
She's in a family.
Yeah.
And she's still a missing victim.
Like, she deserves to have something happen to her more because of her profession. Like, what?
I also think this is a bit, you know, looking at it through the lens of the 1980s.
Right.
I don't think they had like the same.
They're definitely naive to what was going on, and which is probably why there's so many serial killers from this time period. Is just, it's a golden era because they were unaware that this was going on, you know, on the scale that it was, especially in these small municipalities. I mean, they just had no idea.
Definitely.
Maybe. I mean, I could be wrong too.
Right, true. They could have just been brushing it under the rug as far as we know. But local law enforcement wouldn't do anything about the case. So Heidi's father, Joe, spent day and night searching for his daughter. And this is truly heartbreaking. Imagine your daughter goes missing. The police are just like, no, we'll get around to it maybe. Just go calm down and go home. And so you have to take it upon yourself to become essentially an investigator. He would drive across town and interview people at different nightclubs. He filled up countless notebooks with clues. He also tape recorded many of his thoughts and interviews, and those are out there. They've since been turned into the FBI by his niece, Nina, after his death. And unfortunately, he did die sometime after this, and those who knew him, especially I think Tim Miller says this, that Joe died of a broken heart because he never knew what happened to his daughter. And he spent basically his whole rest of his life trying to figure out what happened. So when that neighborhood dog discovered Heidi's remains in April 1984, the body was already in an advanced state of decomposition. She had to be identified by her dental records, which is pretty common in many of these cases. Her bones had also been spread out by animals. Police were hoping to identify a unique signature of the killer, but they really couldn't, and much of the area, including her remains, had been too affected by the elements to really piece anything together. The suspected cause of death was trauma, indicated by her fractured ribs. Police soon learned the Calder road fields where she was found were about 5 miles south of her place of work. Police initially suspected the killer was someone who personally knew her, possibly a coworker, friend, or patron at the Texas Moon. It's a good start. Their search led to a dead end, the same as her father's search did, and to this day, no one has been charged for her murder, and the medical examiner and local law enforcement have been accused of not preserving Heidi's clothing, fingernails, or other items that might have contained crucial forensic evidence, including DNA. And this, as we'll see, will be an ongoing issue in many of these cases.
Which is just appalling.
Yeah.
Like
losing
at the
evidence.
very least. I don't, and this happens all the time today as well. I don't know how this happens. I don't know if there's some sketchy shit going on with the medical examiners, and I'm sure in some places it is.
Yep.
But how this is the one job you have as law enforcement, is to preserve evidence so that if it can't be solved right now, it could potentially be solved as technology progresses down the road. But yes, so much evidence is lost.
Gone.
Which I'm like, what the fuck does that mean?
What happened?
And then the excuses for why it got lost.
Yeah, as far
are
as
even worse.
As far as I could find, they've shifted offices and like they had to move evidence crates around, and they're just like, whoops, we don't know. We just lost it in the mix. It's gone now. And this is for a lot of these cases. And we'll also see with the medical examiner's office, there's weird shit going on there for some of these cases as well.
This is a opportunity for AI to really help, I feel like. Manage and keep track of this stuff and have record keeping. And clearly all these evidence lockers and stuff need to be recorded 24/7. Everything needs to be tracked, have GPS trackers on everything, because this just happens way, way too much. Yeah. And it completely screws these cases over. And because, especially with these cases that go cold, I mean, that's your only hope, is that DNA one day will be able to be tested.
It's preserved, yep.
Our forensic genealogy can be used. And if you have nothing left because it got lost, you're just screwed. And then it's not even your fault, especially, as victims' families find out, they're like, what do you mean you lost it? And they have no control over that.
Yeah.
And had they been able to keep that evidence, they would have preserved it far better than the law enforcement would. It's just insane.
Especially the things that they've lost, which are fingernails.
Yeah.
After fingernail clippings, when the autopsy comes in, which we know, in defensive wounds, that's like how you can get your killer's skin under your fingernails. So losing that is crucial. Clothing, obviously, that's pretty self-explanatory of what DNA could be found there. So it's like, it's not just whatever. It's not like, oh, we lost her toothbrush or whatever. No, this is like really crucial evidence that we're losing throughout the years.
So League City Police Department sucks at investigating these cases, and their medical examiner seems to lose shit constantly.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind as we go forward. But on September 10th, 1984, a 16-year-old named Laura Lynn Miller disappeared. This is Tim Miller's daughter. Laura loved music like Fleetwood Mac, and she was very popular among her friends. She and her family had recently moved into their new house in League City to put her in a new school system, and this house was only a few blocks away from Heidi's. The landline still needed to be hooked up since they had just moved in 2 days before, so her mother had to drive her into town to a local payphone because she wanted to call her boyfriend Vernon and ask if he wanted to come over to the house. Her mother dropped her off at the payphone at the same convenience store where Heidi was last seen, but her mother said she was running late for work. Laura wanted to talk more on the phone, so she told her mother she could just walk home. It was only about half a mile, so no big deal. But later that day, her father Tim got home and Vernon knocked on the front door. And Tim was like, why is Vernon here and Laura's not with you? And Tim asked Vernon, where's Laura? And Vernon's like, I don't know. I thought she was here. And it turns out that Laura never came home, or never made it home, rather. And what's even more tragic about this is that Laura had epilepsy, and she had to take her Dilantin medication twice a day. So she's out there, and at this point, they're worried that, maybe she just walked home and had an episode. She didn't have her medication. And so her family started searching all of the local hospitals to see if she had, someone had found her and taken her there, but she wasn't there. And when the family went to the police, League City Police was like, she probably just ran away. How does that even fucking make sense? They dropped her off at a payphone to call her boyfriend, and the last thing they said to her, or Laura said to her parents, was like, I'll just walk home. I'm going to walk home.
Yeah.
I'm going to run away. That's just what's crazy to me is, how did they get away with this nonsense? It just makes no sense.
And proposing no motive for the person to run away. She had no reason to run away. It makes no sense.
What were they so busy with that they could not take these seriously? That's what I want to know.
That's a good point.
What the hell were they doing?
Right.
Just sitting on their ass eating donuts? What is going on? Probably reading the newspaper, drinking coffee, eating donuts.
For sure.
Because here's the thing about League City. This is a pretty nice suburban area.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a ton of crime. It's not like there's
they're handing out like stop sign infractions and shit like that. Yeah.
Speeding and, petty crime, that kind of stuff. So it's like they should have had all the time in the world to be jumping on this and at least helping these parents find their kids.
And like, you have to be dumb as rocks to someone to come in and be like, hey, my daughter went missing. I last saw her at the exact payphone that someone had just went missing from.
You'd think that would click. You'd be like, oh shit.
You could be an absolute moron and be like, I can connect those dots, right? No.
Scooby-Doo could connect those dots, bro.
And that's a dog.
Yeah.
That's how
literally
stupid.
A dog could connect this.
I can't even imagine. I would be so frustrated too as a parent. I would lose my shit.
Oh, it's so frustrating. Yeah. And I mean, as more time went on, Laura's father, Tim, requested that police search the same area where Heidi Fye's remains were found, but they declined, which I'm like, what?
Crazy.
What are you talking about? And trust me, I'm channeling Tim's energy here because this is how Tim's had it up to here with these idiots over there.
We all need to channel Tim's energy because he gets shit done.
He is an inspirational figure, and I mean, he's just done so much cool stuff, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But Tim also discovered that the police still hadn't filed a missing persons report on Laura, and he was later quoted as saying, "They did their best to convince me that I'd lost my damn mind," which that says everything.
Mm-hmm.
Police even told him not to talk to Heidi's family because her murder was, in their own words, an isolated incident. How the hell do you know that? And how does that make any sense? Doing their best to minimize and probably brush under the rug.
Yep, exactly.
We don't want people getting scared out here because there's something really bad going on.
And we don't want more work on our plate.
Yeah. So that we can do who knows what.
Yeah.
Nothing. But law enforcement ended up taking a sample of her clothes, hair, and dental x-rays long after the fact. And in the meantime, another victim was found in the Calder Road fields by a group of boys riding their bicycles through the area on February 2nd, 1986. And police also couldn't identify this body, and she didn't match any missing persons cases in the area. So because they were unable to identify her, she just became a Jane Doe. And she had been shot with a .22 caliber bullet that had actually severed her spine. At the time, the fields were very thick and overgrown, and visibility was low. It was just overall hard to walk through this field. And crucial evidence could have been hidden all across these 25 acres. Police suspected the discovered victims were possibly murdered by the same suspect since the dumping locations were so close together. And while police searched the area for any trace of evidence on the Jane Doe case, they discovered a third body the same day, about 25 yards from the other victim. And this would turn out to be the body of Laura Miller. Oh, man. How dumb. How do you feel?
Man.
And Tim knew.
He called it. You could have gotten a cadaver dog or a bloodhound, sniffed some clothes, sent the dog. They're like, oh, well, it's hard to see in these fields and it's hard to walk through. Just that's what the bloodhounds are for.
Nope, they don't want to do any of that.
Yeah.
So Laura Miller's remains were discovered 17 months after she had gone missing, less than 60 feet from where Heidi had been found.
Crazy.
Only 28 of her bones were recovered, and she had to be identified by her dental records since her remains had also been severely decomposed. I mean, she'd been out there for 17 months.
Mm-hmm.
She had also been placed under a tree, which was very similar to how Heidi's remains were found. There was also a blue plaid Western-style shirt, which was discovered in the field near the bodies. There were several stains on it, but DNA analysis was not available at the time, and many believe this shirt could have belonged to the killer, but guess what? You guessed it, it would end up getting lost by law enforcement over the years, which is just insane to me.
Mm-hmm.
Literally has stains on it. There's definitely DNA on this thing.
Mm-hmm.
They lose it, which is just crucial forensic evidence. Some believe it was lost when law enforcement officers were being moved, like we talked about earlier. But now, despite the advancement in technology, including DNA analysis, there's no shirt to test anymore.
Gone.
Which Tim is livid about this. He's like, this could crack this whole case, and it's just gone. Tim, Laura's father, believed that if local police had simply searched the Calder Roads Fields area, like he had asked, not only would they have found Laura's body earlier, but there might have still been potential evidence on her remains that could have helped identify the killer before the elements destroyed it. And they would have been able to likely determine the exact cause of death, which would again lend more evidence to figuring out who did it, but also figuring out if these victims are all connected. The county kept Laura's remains for 3 years and 9 months without ever determining her cause of death, although they told her father, Tim Miller, they'd only keep her for 60 days, which this shit blows my mind too. The fact that these medical examiners keep the bot remains for so long.
Yeah.
And for what?
Yep.
It makes no sense. Tim had to threaten them with a lawsuit in order to get her remains back, which is insane. And at this point, he's no longer feeling very good about local law enforcement whatsoever. He definitely doesn't trust them.
I wouldn't either,
which
at that rate.
I don't think any of us would in this situation. He also questioned if those remains even belonged to his daughter when he received them. So when he finally got her remains back, he took the skull and had a dentist confirm that it was in fact Laura, because that's how skeptical he was. He was like, I don't even know if they're giving me
her body. Yeah. Yep.
And this happens too.
That speaks volumes to this case. That the victim's father doesn't even believe he's getting his daughter's remains back. That's crazy.
And his hunch was right. Believe it or not, the medical examiner's office had accidentally mixed some of Jane Doe's bones with Laura's. So I'm like,
yeah, I think there were like
these sick fucks.
Yeah.
Working.
Or how incompetent are you that like bodies are just mixed together? I think there was about like 6 ribs or something.
Like, I will just save a box and put them together.
Right. Yep.
What the hell, man? Laura's death, and of course, this horrible investigation that followed really, really put a strain on Tim's marriage, and he ended up getting a divorce 6 months after the discovery of his daughter's body. On top of this, they had already lost a child to sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, and Tim's brother had also committed suicide just before Laura disappeared. Oh man, this is just heartbreaking all the way around. Tim had also struggled with alcoholism for many years, but he did eventually get sober. And this is the kind of guy that he is. Tim later founded and directed Texas EquiSearch, which I think if you're, listen to true crime quite a bit, you've probably heard EquiSearch before. Tim Miller, he's the man behind it, and he started it in 2000, which EquiSearch began as a search and recovery team on horseback to support families of lost and missing persons. But it's evolved since then, and they do all sorts of different types of searches, including using technology like drones and all-terrain vehicles. But this nonprofit organization has conducted searches in 48 states and in 11 different countries. They've also worked on over 2,600 cases and have found 441 people alive and 355 victims deceased. And even before founding EquiSearch, Tim spent most of his free time assisting in the searches for many of the other Texas killing fields victims who disappeared around I-45. I mean, he just became he dedicated his entire life to this cause, to getting justice for these victims and figuring out who's behind all these killings. As for the Calder Road Fields investigations, Officer Robert Valentine, who worked the cases, later admitted that the scene where they found the bodies was, quote, secured, but not as secure as I hope it would have been, because there was no crime scene tape and only a single police officer sitting in a lawn chair was there to secure the scene. Which that's baffling to me. It's like,
it's concerning that, look, I don't know how much control Officer Robert Valentine had in this situation, but you look around and you'd be like, yeah, this isn't as secure as I hope it would be. Maybe I should do something about it. Maybe I should talk to someone and be like, hey, we should secure this a bit more. Like I was in retrospect, like in hindsight, he's talking later, like, yeah, it wasn't really secure. I thought it wasn't secure. You're the officer. What?
Get some tape up at least. Yeah. Do something. He also admitted there was a lot of, quote, old boy stuff going on at the time, which the good old boys, you know.
Yeah, and you can extract whatever you want from that.
It can mean a lot of things, but I think that's just kind of presumed when you hear how incompetent they were.
Yeah, for sure.
Just lack of care.
Yeah.
These specific murders were labeled the Calder Road killings at the time, but people began referring to them more as the Texas Killing Fields after the movie The Killing Fields was released in 1984, which was actually a film about the Cambodian genocide. And when the new name caught on, this was when the murders really started getting national attention, as it usually does when, that's why the media kind of adds these names to it. Sometimes it's like, just for the shock and awe and get people to buy papers and pay attention. But the FBI will do this as well, give killers names and stuff, because it does kind of help stick in people's minds.
It gets traction, yeah.
It's easier than remembering specific names, I feel.
Right, yeah.
With big wireless providers, what you see is never what you get. Somewhere between the store and your first month's bill, the price you thought you were paying magically skyrockets. But with Mint Mobile, you'll never have to worry about the gotchas ever again. When Mint Mobile says $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan, they mean it. I recently switched our company phones over to Mint Mobile because I was paying way too much for wireless with the big wireless companies. And yeah, I got a $15 a month plan, unlimited data, which is what we need. And I mean, I'm saving hundreds of dollars every year thanks to Mint Mobile. Mint Mobile is here to rescue you with premium wireless plans starting at just $15 a month. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. That's a great thing about Mint Mobile. You're not sacrificing coverage, reliability, speed, or anything like that because they're using, the big guys' network. You're just saving money at the end of the day. Plus, you can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all of your existing contacts. So it's super simple, especially if you have an eSIM card. It takes minutes to get switched over to Mint Mobile. And if not, you have a physical SIM card, they'll even hook you up with one of those so you can get switched over in no time. So ditch overpriced wireless with Mint Mobile's deal and get 3 months of premium wireless service for just $15 a month. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month premium wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/lightsout. That's mintmobile.com/lightsout. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/lightsout. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigs on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. By 1986, the local police were pretty overwhelmed, and within a few years, League City had gone from a relatively safe town with low crime rates to having several abductions and murders. As law enforcement connected more dots between the murders, many realized that these abductions and murders might have been connected to cases dating back to 1971. So they started getting their bearings, getting all the papers together, looking at all of the data, and they're like, oh, there could be more connections here than we originally thought.
Mm-hmm.
Between 1971 and 1977, the remains of 11 girls had been discovered. Many were discovered near I-45 and were scattered throughout several different jurisdictions. So there was a disconnect between the shared information of local police departments and the cases. they didn't have the computer systems that they do today. They didn't have the ability to share this information as easily as they can today. So it was all very manual.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it took them forever to just get together and be like, hey, what's going on in your county? What's going on in your town? Oh, that's weird. I'm having the same issue over here. Maybe they're connected. It's not that far away from each other.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, the murders that were committed in the 1970s were typically along a different stretch of I-45 compared to the murders in the 80s. But the big question was, were some or all of these murders connected? Had a potential serial killer been operating along I-45 for years, or was there more than one killer? And that's the big question, I think, even to this day.
Yep. So we'll get into kind of our first suspect here, because these disappearances continued with no suspects charged with a crime. And on July 29th, 1985, about a year after Laura Miller disappeared, a 29-year-old woman named Ellen Ray Simpson Beason disappeared. Ellen had lived with her parents and brother in Friendswood, Texas. She had a stable job as a waitress at the Texas Moon Club in League City, which is where Heidi Fye worked, and she enjoyed dancing on the weekends. So Ellen was last seen at the Texas Moon Club, and she went there with her friend Candy Gifford. While at the club, she met a local construction worker named Clyde Edwin Hedrick. Now, there is a question if she already knew him before this night. Many witnesses say that she had and that they were even dating at the time, so keep that in mind. Clyde had moved to Houston from Florida for the booming construction projects, and he quickly found work as a roofer. At the time, Clyde, he was a good-looking guy. He always wore a black cowboy hat. He loved going to the bars for the line dancing contests, and this is how he picked up women. I mean, he was a really great dancer, apparently, so he would often win these line dancing contests, and his nickname was even Clyde the Slide. He thought of himself as a ladies' man, although others thought of him more as a pickup artist or a con man.
Or in modern terms, a fuckboy.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So later that evening, Ellen was impressed by Clyde's dancing and they hit it off. She later told her friends that she and Clyde made plans to go skinny dipping, and this was the last time she was seen alive. Clyde was brought in for questioning in 1985 in the case of Ellen's suspicious disappearance. At first, he claimed that Ellen had left with some friends in a truck that night and they didn't even go skinny dipping. So with no further evidence, police kind of just left it at that.
Like, okay.
Yeah,
we'll take your word for it.
Right? Ellen's friend Candy, who had begun dating Clyde soon after Ellen's disappearance, kind of kept pressing him on her disappearance. And the more she talked about Ellen, the more annoyed he got. She could tell it was kind of a sensitive area. And one day, this was about 6 months after Ellen had gone missing, he got so annoyed that he drove Candy out to the spot where Ellen's remains had been. By now, they were decomposed remains, mostly skeletal, and they were underneath a sofa in a wooded area beside an old causeway road in Galveston County. So it took nearly another 6 months for Candy to even go to the police. So something, she was either terrified of Clyde, of what he would do to her. According to her, Clyde had threatened her if she were to tell anyone, which I could kind of believe that. But there's a question why she didn't go to police immediately. Unfortunately, we don't have a definitive answer for that.
I mean, based on what everybody said about Clyde, I think they were scared of him. I mean, he's especially if he had just brought you to an ex's
body
grave, essentially, or remains. I think you'd be terrified that he'd do the same to you.
It almost seems like a threat in that perspective of being like, if you don't shut up about this, this might be you. At the time, the medical examiner was unable to determine Ellen's cause of death, but they discovered that she was still wearing the same necklace she had worn on the night of her disappearance. Clyde later admitted to police that both of them had gone skinny dipping in a nearby lake after leaving the club, so he's changing his story a little bit here. He claimed that she went in first and had accidentally drowned. At the time, his truck had apparently gotten stuck in the mud, and he didn't spot her until he got unstuck and then turned on his headlights, out into where they were swimming, and then claimed that he panicked. He got her body, went to his sister's house, he switched vehicles, went back to the bar, hung out until close, and then disposed of her body out of fear of being accused of foul play.
Because that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, like
Good
what?
God. Yeah.
What? He also claimed Ellen was under the influence at the time of her drowning, which is, part of his explanation for him panicking, like, oh no, because we're on drugs, so I might get in trouble for it. That's why I dumped the body.
Mm-hmm.
He then claimed he was heading to a hospital at some point, but instead he dumped her on the side of the road. So the Galveston County medical examiner, Dr. Korndorfer, which he will come up quite a bit. So remember Korndorfer.
Korndorfer.
I know, what a stupid name too. He could not determine her cause of death. This will be a point of contention going forward.
Which is crazy because we'll tell you later that he should have absolutely been able to determine her cause of death.
Exactly.
So some's fishy with Korndorfer.
Yes. Since authorities couldn't prove that she had even been murdered because of this lack of determining cause of death, in 1996, Clyde was only charged with and convicted of abusing her corpse, which is a misdemeanor, and he was only sentenced to a year. And after only a year in county jail, he was let free, but police, apparently they still kept him on their radar since he might have been connected to some of the other murders. And so remember Clyde Hedrick in this case, because we will come back to Ellen's case a bit later. But the really interesting thing about these Texas killing fields cases is that they unfolded over a series of decades often. None of this was just like cut and dry and, oh, we found the remains, we know how she died, we got the suspect and he's gone. A lot of it is really drawn out, really convoluted, a lot of incompetence in between here. So just remember Clyde for later because he will come up quite a bit.
So now we're in 1991 and a fourth victim is discovered in the Calder fields. On September 8th of that year, a couple on horseback were making their way through the killing fields horse trails, and along the path, they smelled something awful. And after following the scent, they found a decomposing body roughly 100 yards south of the other victims. Police failed to identify the victim, so they named her Janet Doe, making this a second unknown victim out of the four in the Calder Road fields. A medical examiner determined that she had died about 6 weeks prior, but couldn't determine the cause of death. Much like the other Jane Doe, she didn't match any cases of missing persons in the area. Today, DNA evidence collected from these victims could be tested, and many have scrutinized the League City Police's handling of their evidence. At the time, they tried to identify both Jane and Janet Doe through different means. They tried to rebuild the skulls and put clay on them to estimate what the victims might have looked like, but still no one was able to identify them from their very poorly made clay molds.
And off those molds, they tried to make sketches too, but yeah, they didn't really look like
pretty
that.
Bad if you look at them, yeah. By now, this Calder Road Fields case was being treated as a serial killing case, which gave the FBI the authority to investigate. And the profile they put together suggested that the killer lived close to the fields, and he kept clippings from the newspapers of the case. He had a superior attitude, and of course, he had difficulty in his relationships with women. So a man named Robert William Abel, who owned 2 properties connected to the killing fields, was immediately put on their radar. He owned the land with the riding stables just to the west. He was actually a former NASA scientist who helped develop the modern Saturn rocket that got astronauts to the moon. He was very intelligent, and he oftentimes had tons of difficulty in romantic relationships, and he was known to abuse animals. He also had 3 ex-wives, and one of his ex-wives said that he threatened to kill her if she did not give him sex like he wanted. Multiple ex-wives claimed that he used to beat his horses, and if one of his horses died, he would just leave their carcass out in the field to rot, similar to how the victims were left out in the fields to decompose. And Robert was immediately cooperative with the police and the FBI. He had even provided search equipment and cleared nearby brush to make the search easier. But he came under suspicion at some point because he was too involved in the investigation, which this is a common tactic for some killers. Meanwhile, the momentum and focus on Clyde Hedrick had faded, and the FBI began focusing more on Robert. And the truth around this too is that Tim Miller was very at it. You know, he's been investigating it over all these years, looking at different suspects. And I think he was a main driver for why law enforcement and FBI really looked at Robert Abel
for sure
initially, especially. So
there were many years Tim was convinced Robert was definitely the killer here. And I don't know, maybe there was a little bit of guilt from the police department's end where it's like, hey, we didn't listen to Tim the first time. Maybe we should listen to him now. So they really leaned into Robert Abel as the suspect.
But again, it was also due to the fact that when the FBI profilers came in, based on their profile, they started looking at who's in the area, and Robert Abel just kind of fit some of those parameters that they came up with. So that was part of it as well.
You brought up a good point kind of off mic before we started, how you were saying like he does add up for the profile, true, but why dump bodies on your own property?
Yeah.
Or even close by. And it doesn't really seem like a smart, for a NASA scientist too, that doesn't seem
it doesn't
smart.
Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Although there's always that, hiding in plain sight sort of strategy. So maybe it could have been something like that. But I think for him, based on knowing who he is, it would seem like a very dumb move to just, there's a lot of other areas in this region that he could have easily, if he was the one who did this, take the bodies to. And why would he just leave them in his field? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
There are cases where people do dump bodies on their own property.
Yeah, I mean, there's serial killers that bury their victims under their front porch.
Right. Yep.
So it wouldn't be totally out of the ordinary. But
what was there was a big serial killer case. Was it Gacy? He had like 13 bodies under his basement
Gacy
floor.
And Fred and Rosemary West.
Yeah, true. Yeah,
in
the basement.
Yep. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
it does happen.
Yeah, serial killers will try to hide things in plain sight.
Yeah.
So wouldn't have been completely out of the ordinary. But again, Robert is actively like assisting. He's trying to make it easier for them to search. He's talking to the media. But all suspicions are on him at this point. So the League City Police Department, supported by the FBI, then released an affidavit available to the public claiming that Robert Abel was potentially a sexual serial killer who committed these Calder Road Fields murders, which is wild.
Crazy that
they just like put it out there, accused him, which...
No, they're not charging him.
No.
They're just saying like, yeah, he's the killer. Which is wild.
Based on our profile, this guy lines up, so therefore
it's him.
Yeah, it's insane that they did that, and as we'll see, it kind of ruined his life.
Yeah.
But this caused other local police stations to panic, thinking that the other Texas killing field victims might be connected to Robert as well. But Robert, he's like, I didn't do any of this. I had nothing to do with any of these murders. Detectives then searched the property trying to find anything to connect him to the crime. So of course they got warrants to do this. And they did find some strange things, like old newspaper articles about the Calder Road killings.
Which fits the profile.
Right. A human tooth with a gold crown, several .22 caliber firearms, a woman's glove, 6 pairs of eyeglasses, and a mysterious key. So
pretty odd.
Yeah, definitely some odd stuff for sure. I mean, as we'll talk about, .22 caliber round was used to kill the Jane Doe. And so he's got a .22 caliber as well. Although this is a very, very common type of gun.
Yeah.
Like
a lot of people have 22.
Most people have a .22 caliber in their collection. But reportedly, he also had 4 photographs he had taken of the locations where the bodies were found after the fact.
So it's like, is that a trophy? What is that exactly?
I think that's what police are kind of thinking. Investigators considered that .22 caliber gun they found might have been connected to the bullet that was found in Jane Doe's spine, but when her autopsy had been performed, the Galveston County medical examiner had ruined the bullet while stripping the bones in a boiling acidic solution. Just like, how did you not know?
Right, what?
To like make sure you get the bullet before you do all of this. Like, if you don't know what this is a technique used in an autopsy to remove soft tissue from a skeleton without damaging the bones to search for wounds. But unfortunately, this stripped potential evidence from the bullet, and they could no longer match the bullet to the gun it was fired from. Which, again, this was a huge piece of evidence
Could have been a slam dunk.
Yeah. They could have easily figured out if this came from Robert Abel's gun or not and definitively ruled him out.
Yeah.
Or
because we have no idea.
Figured out this is the guy.
Yeah. And not only does that, stripping that bullet, now we can't tie it to Robert Abel. We can't tie it to anybody.
Right.
Ever.
There's no way to know.
Yeah.
And after no more substantial evidence was found, the FBI failed to link Robert to any of the murders. And he defended himself, saying that the items he collected were only collected in an attempt to help law enforcement in their search. And so, people are pretty split on him, and we'll talk about Tim Miller's thoughts a little bit more later. But some have pointed out that this behavior would be appropriate for a scientist to go and collect information, things they find in the area.
Clippings, in order to help. Photographs.
Right.
Yeah, it does kind of line up.
Which I think could make sense. I mean, if this has happened on your property, like, why not try to help and,
right.
Look into things a little bit.
Yeah. Crazy to me, though, that, they couldn't find any substantial evidence, right? They failed to link Robert to any of these murders, yet that affidavit was still released to the public saying, it's this guy. Blows my mind. That's so damaging. That's like,
imagine it's this guy, but we can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Like, we're not going to go bring him in and, try to prosecute him.
Right. Ugh.
Yeah, that was a major misstep.
Yeah.
It just gave everybody tunnel vision too.
Yep. It's like, it has to be him. Why would it be anyone else? Why would the FBI screw up on this, right? So years passed with very little advancement on any of these cases, and several more teenage girls went missing near Interstate 45. A 12-year-old girl who loved ballet named Laura Smither disappeared on April 3rd, 1997. She was last seen in Friendswood, Texas, about 9 miles northwest of the Calder road fields. She was jogging down her home street after telling her mother she was going on a 20-minute run, and she never came home. Her parents were making pancakes, expecting her to be home soon, but when she never came back, they notified police. Her mother, Gay Smither, called friends, family, and neighbors to come help and search for her daughter, and she spent days passing out flyers in the rain even. Up until then, Friendswood, Texas, it was considered one of the safest places to live in the nation, and neighbors often left their doors unlocked. They had formed a tight-knit community, so when Laura Smither went missing, there was a massive public outcry, and because of the outcry, police didn't categorize this case as a runaway situation like they had done with pretty much everyone in the past. Friendswood Police, Harris County Sheriff's Department, and the FBI all got involved in the case.
Which, to be fair, too, this is a different town, different jurisdiction, different police department.
Yeah.
So you can just see the drastic
shift
in response here. But I do think it's also because this is a 12-year-old girl, everybody sees an innocent girl. There's no way, this was...
You can't write her off as anything but like an innocent child.
Right, right. Who went for a run before breakfast in her neighborhood. Which is crazy.
Yeah.
And disappeared.
Yep. And we also have, now that the police and the FBI is involved in this, and there's a national spotlight on these cases, I also think that's why
pressure's
they immediately
went
to okay, we are not calling this a runaway at all. We would look like idiots if we did, which we already look like idiots, but if we continue to do this, we'll just continue to look like idiots. So the community also came together to search for Laura, and they went on horseback, boat, car, on foot. 6,000 people combed through the local areas. That's how big this case became. Several U.S. military personnel also joined in, and locals also brought their dogs out to search.
All the stops.
Everything.
For this.
Everything. Which really, it's easy to say in hindsight, but this should have been the tactic for most of
this is a response
victims.
Every missing person should get
100%
from
ideally
these resources, because it's so sad that it is cherry picked when it comes to cases or who they search for. It's the fucked up reality of our system.
And my thing is that even it's a small police department, even if you don't have this many resources at your disposal because, you know, there are budgetary restraints, et cetera, et cetera. I cannot imagine that getting a hound to go sniff out those fields for even just a few days would have really cost that much money and time and resources. I just can't believe it. So, like, it's great to see that there were so many people involved on this search, and I think that's why we'll see this Laura would be found so quickly. But the fact that the previous Laura, they just didn't do their due diligence, and they could have just done a little bit, but they didn't even do a little bit.
Yeah. No, and not only that, I think there was also scenarios where League City Police Department was refusing help from other agencies, you know, because this is starting to blow up, and Harris County and some of these other, you know, jurisdictions are like, hey, you need help, let us come in. But kind of going back to the you know, what the vibe was like in there, like they were very protective over, you know, what they were doing, the cases they were working on, and they didn't want any help. They want to be the ones to solve it. They want to be ones to figure everything out, even though they're not doing anything. So there's a lot of that happening versus you go up to Friendswood, there's a lot of collaboration happening. They're welcoming additional resources coming in. But for some reason, League City is so protective about what's going on within their department. That they're not willing. And I think it goes back to that sort of attitude and ego that's wrapped up in probably the people who have been running that place for a long, long time. They don't want to be exposed. They don't want to look bad. And so they don't want anybody coming in and showing them up. And obviously the FBI finally came in. But even then, the FBI's even said they were paying the ass to work with. They were very apprehensive to anything we suggested that they do. And it's like,
And that went on for decades too. We'll see towards the end of this case, the FBI was even trying to get them to make some moves to identify the Jane and Janet Doe. And they were even getting pushback then. That was 2016, 17. So for years.
Seems like nothing's changed.
Right,
After all these years, which is baffling.
17 days after Laura Smithers' disappearance on April 20th, 1997, her body was found in a retention pond in Pasadena, Texas. Locals who were looking for her smelled what they thought was a dead animal in the water, but it turned out to be Laura's decomposed remains. And they also found her, this is how they identified her, was through a silver ring with her initials on one finger. She was also identified by her braces later on. Laura became one of at least 35 unsolved cases in a 3-county area involving missing or dead young women. Just to put that into perspective. By then, more media attention had been brought to these cases. Unlike how police and media had treated many of the previous victims, Laura Smithers was portrayed as a good girl from a great family who lived in a safe neighborhood, which, you know, I'm sure those are true. It's just we're seeing kind of the drastic change in response to this from law enforcement. So much more pressure was put on law enforcement, and they quickly considered the case a homicide investigation. By the next year, the Friendswood School District was so panicked about the disappearances that they even passed out these child identification kits. And this kit had been created by the Laura Recovery Center, which is a nonprofit established by Laura Smithers' parents to aid in the search for and recovery of kidnapped victims. These kits included information on how to report your child missing, fingerprinting your children, and saving DNA swabs and locks of hair.
Super smart. Love this.
Yeah, might as well have this on file. You know, if this is going on in your community,
I say even today,
be safe
to some extent.
Just
world's
keep that
just as scary as it was back then.
True.
Obviously, it's a little bit harder to get away with stuff like this today with technology, but I mean, it's not a bad idea. Better be safe than sorry.
And if anything, it's just would be a very quick way to be able to identify, you know, no matter what.
No matter
happens,
what, yeah.
You know?
Exactly. It could be a, accidental thing or something.
Right.
You know, you never know.
Yep. So meanwhile, local law enforcement created a list of all the sex offenders in Galveston and Harris County, including some nearby areas, and they ended up with a huge list of about 2,100 people. It became apparent that these communities that were once considered, you know, safe, weren't as safe as they were thought to be.
Which this is like a common theme you see throughout any case. I feel like every community thinks they're
the safest.
The safest.
It's like, oh, we're a small little rural whatever. We're a small little suburb.
You look at like relative data
everywhere.
and like, there's obviously like safer neighborhoods, but
for sure,
all areas see crime.
Yeah.
All area, maybe different kinds of crime, but
right.
There's no like area with zero crime.
Right.
Period. Like there's always crime where there's people. In rural areas, obviously there's usually less crime and less probably maybe violent crime. I mean, not necessarily, there's places where violent crime is off the charts in some of these rural areas because there's nobody responding to these incidents.
For sure, yeah.
It's all kind of just relative,
yeah.
I feel like. But
they even say like Alaska, I guess if you look at it like per capita and whatnot, it's not that bad. But there are like horrific things that happen way out in Alaska. But you think that is like the most isolated rural you can get. Shit happens everywhere.
Mm. A few months after Laura Smither disappeared, Kellyanne Cox, a 20-year-old mother and student at University of North Texas, disappeared on July 15th, 1997. She was last seen at a Conoco gas station and convenience store in Denton, Texas. She had locked herself out of her car and called her boyfriend on the station's outdoor payphone. And she had been headed to a tour of a city jail with her criminal justice class, and then she was just gone. She just vanished. Law enforcement searched her car but couldn't find any evidence of foul play, and they couldn't even confirm that a crime had even been committed. About a month later, 17-year-old Jessica Lee Cain disappeared. She was last seen at a Bennigan's restaurant near Baybrook Mall in Clear Lake, Texas. She had gone there with her theater friends and left around 1:30 a.m. Her father then found her truck abandoned along Interstate 45, and she was reported missing. Her purse was still inside of the vehicle. Luckily, there was a massive community search, and I would credit this largely to Tim Miller as well as Bob and Gay Smither. I mean, they were like, we got to get out there and find these girls. Both Kelly's and Jessica's bodies were nowhere to be found, though. And there was still a question of whether Laura Smither, Jessica Cain, and Kelly Cox were connected to the Calder Road field killings. Police considered the possibility, but there was no evidence that they could find that connected the crimes. And there was a significant gap in time between when the last Calder Road Fields victim was discovered and when Jessica, Laura, and Kelly went missing. Police had thousands of potential suspects at the time. Meanwhile, Robert Abel was still a suspect in the Calder Road Field killings. Because, at this point, they have no specific evidence to point towards a specific person.
Mm-hmm.
They just have a profile at this point. And, they're going through their databases. They're pulling all the sex offender lists, the child sex offender lists. And there's just thousands of people on those lists.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to drill through all those. But again, there's nothing, nothing found at the scene to connect to any one person.
And a lot of this, we could contribute to the elements just destroying a lot of evidence that would be crucial in these cases.
Too much time is passing after the girls disappear to when they find their remains.
Right.
That most of it's destroyed by that point. For years, Tim Miller had been convinced that Robert was his daughter's killer, and he never gave up. He continued searching those fields along with cadaver dogs and heavy machinery, looking for any evidence he could find from the victims. His search ended up uncovering a purse and a woman's clothes, but they couldn't be connected to a specific victim. Tim was so adamant that Robert was a killer that Robert eventually filed for an order of protection to keep Tim away from him. And by Tim's own admission, he had once put a gun to Robert's head and just constantly tried to make Robert's life miserable. Just harassing him, because he was convinced that this was his daughter's killer.
Right.
By then, Robert Abel had become the villain of his community. Because, as you can probably imagine, Tim Miller is very well known in his community. Everybody knows him.
Especially by now.
Yeah. Everybody knows what he does with EquiSearch. And so, they're going to trust what Tim Miller says. And if Tim Miller thinks that it's Robert Abel, most people in the community are going to be on board with that.
Yeah.
But it got really, really hard to live in this community. So Robert Abel ended up shutting down Stardust Trail Rides, and he moved back to his family ranch in another county in Texas. But by the summer of 1997, no one had been arrested for the murders in the Calder Road Field murders, and nearly every nearby law enforcement officer, including the FBI, investigated these cases. They were sharing notes and data and evidence that they had, and they're still coming up with nothing. Things took a major turn, though, especially in relation to some of these I-45 murder cases, when in May 1997, a 911 call came into emergency services reporting that a 19-year-old named Sandra Sapow had been abducted in a convenience store parking lot. And according to her, a strange man had approached her saying that, hey, you've got a flat tire. And before she knew it, this man had pulled out a knife, was holding it to her, and was like, get in the truck and don't scream, basically. So he ended up taking her down the highway, and Sandra ended up jumping out of his truck on the freeway and survived. She suffered pretty severe injuries, as you can imagine, jumping out of the truck, but she was able to escape this man. Obviously, people saw this happen, saw her roll out of the truck, and they were able to, make note that the vehicle that she jumped out of was heading northbound on I-45. And, she went to the hospital, and police went in and talked to her, and she later explained to them and to everybody else that I'd rather jump and kill myself than him doing what he was going to do. So I jumped. It's such a crazy story. And she was very lucky that she survived.
Yeah.
Survived jumping out of the vehicle. But she gave police as much detail as she possibly could. She wasn't able to catch the license plate, but she recalled that he drove a white Ford dually pickup truck. And she could also describe what the inside looked like. And she was able to give a description of the man that had kidnapped her. She said he was a 40-year-old white male with brown or dirty blonde hair, a receding hairline, bags under his eyes, and he was wearing a black cowboy hat. Based on her description, the police were able to put a sketch together, and many people started wondering if this guy was a killer that they have been looking for so long. So they went out, caught this guy, and Sandra later identified him in a police lineup, and this man was none other than William Lewis Reece. William, who often went by Bill, worked construction in the area, and police noticed that he was also a registered sex offender in Oklahoma who had recently gotten out of prison after serving time for 2 different sexual assaults. And they actually did pretty good with the sketch on this one.
Yeah.
It does look a lot like Bill.
Yeah, thankfully her description was spot on.
The police immediately got a search warrant for Bill, and they went and searched his home and his truck. They did end up finding the cowboy hat that Sandra had described, but they really didn't find a whole lot else. But they ended up arresting him for kidnapping and the attempted murder of Sandra. The police also noticed that he had worked on a construction project in a new subdivision very close to where Laura Smither lived. As it turned out, the day that Laura went missing, William was let out of work early by his foreman because it was about to rain. Law enforcement theorized that William then spotted Laura while he was driving his truck and somehow lured her to get inside. And this would be about a month before he had tried to kidnap Sandra. He soon became police's prime suspect in the Laura Smither case, and he also became a suspect in the Calder Road field killings. According to FBI agents, it's extremely rare to have 2 serial killers in close proximity committing crimes at the same time, but it was confirmed that William had been in prison at the time that the other Calder Road field murders were happening, so those earlier ones. But soon after, they did suspect him as being the perpetrator of the Jessica Cain disappearance. But Jessica Cain's body still hadn't been discovered, so it was difficult to put a murder investigation together. In police interviews, William claimed it was all set up and that he had never even met the victims he was being accused of killing. As for Laura Smither, the prosecution felt that there wasn't enough evidence to charge him with the murder. Still, Laura's parents would always make their presence known in court during the kidnapping trial of Sandra Sapow. William was later convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 60 years in prison. Remember William Reece's case because, again, we'll talk about him later. We'll kind of, at the very end, basically look at all the suspects again, and also give you kind of where they're at, what happened to them.
Right. So as for the Calder Road field killings, remember we ruled out William Reece because he was in prison at the time that these were occurring. So police kept their investigation focused back on Robert Abel. This was the man they outed as the killer in their affidavit, although there was no evidence connecting him to the murders. Eventually, even Tim Miller, who was the biggest opponent of Robert Abel for years, no longer believed that Robert was the killer. Tim also recently admitted that he still felt guilty about how he had treated Robert over the years and still Many in League City believed he was a serial killer up until the day he died, and some still believe he was the killer. In July 2005, Robert's golf cart ended up on a nearby train track and he was killed by a passing train. It is unclear if this was an accident or suicide. Tim later said about Robert, quote, "It totally destroyed his life until he couldn't stand what they did anymore, couldn't deal with it." Tim was luckily able to apologize to Robert during an emotional embrace that they had only a few months before he had passed. And during their final interaction, Robert told Tim, quote, "Don't let that police department destroy your life like they've destroyed mine." Tim Miller then turned most of his attention to Clyde Hedrick. This was the man convicted of, if you remember earlier, abuse of a corpse in the Alan Beason case. Throughout the years, police also kept their eyes on Clyde, and by the 2000s, he had built up a long list of criminal offenses, including assault, evading arrest, terroristic threat, DWI, criminal trespassing, enticing a child, possession, theft, criminal mischief, and attempted arson. So in 2011, Clyde's ex-wife approached authorities and claimed that he had frequently made incriminating remarks regarding Ellen Beason's death. In 1996, so backtrack a little bit, medical examiners not from the county had actually defleshed the skull and noted that Ellen had suffered several severe skull fractures that were not found in the original examination. So forensic anthropologist Dr. Gil King determined the fractures were caused by homicide. Another examiner, Dr. Krause, also confirmed it was a homicide caused by blunt force trauma. Remains were then sent back to Galveston County medical examiner, who was Dr. Korndorfer, the man who originally examined her, but he stuck with his original determination. He claimed that the fracture in her skull may have been caused well after her death, and there was no fracture originally, even though he had not defleshed the skull before his examination, although he claimed that he did.
So who's lying?
So somebody's lying here.
What's going on? Like,
it doesn't make any sense. And then photographs that were taken by Dr. Gil King do not corroborate his claims that he had defleshed the skull. Regardless, the work on this case had stopped for years. So this was back in 1996. So fast forward back to 2011, the FBI reopened the case. And in 2012, with the blessing of the family, they exhumed Ellen Beason's body. Her remains yet again were examined. Dr. Gil King and Dr. Krause confirmed again that her case was a homicide. It was caused by blunt force trauma to the skull. In 2013, authorities brought Clyde Hedrick back in for questioning, and he still would not confess to the murder of Ellen Beason, and he stuck to the same story as before, which is where, she accidentally drowned. I got her in my car, did a bunch of stuff, panicked, then dumped her at the side of the road. That was his initial story. According to a fellow inmate, Clyde had told them that on the night of Ellen's disappearance, Ellen had actually come to when Clyde had placed her in the back of his truck. She wasn't even dead yet. Allegedly, Clyde then panicked and hit her in the head with a table leg, which then killed her.
Which this is very specific detail here.
Right.
Down to what the object was.
Yeah, and hitting her in the head, which is the medical examiner had even failed to identify, right? Like the break in the skull. So that wasn't until 1996.
And this is we can't obviously show you the pictures, but in the Netflix documentary, they do show you some of the skeletal photographs. And I mean, this is a
off the side
huge fracture. I mean, there's, according to Mr. Korndorfer over here, he's like, it could have been damaged, after the fact. It's like, no, this is like something extremely heavy with a lot of force had to have hit this skull. I mean, it's a massive fracture.
Yeah. And unfortunately, God, when you think about this case, it could have happened after the fact. Like, I guess we can't rule that out completely. Right. Knowing the incompetency of this medical examiner, he could have,
dropped it on the ground and stepped on it.
Exactly. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because we're mixing up bones, we're not getting things straight. We're not defleshing bodies. We're ruining bullet evidence. Like, I don't know what's going on in that medical examiner's office.
Guess we can't put it past him that maybe he did do something to her.
Right. Yeah. It could have happened, but I think it's unlikely. This episode is brought to you by Every Plate. I am a hungry boy. And you know what? I don't like to go to bed hungry. I don't like to wake up hungry. I don't like to be hungry. And I also, on top of that, I hate going to the grocery store. It's like the worst experience. Well, I don't want to be trapped there anymore. Right? It feels like a prison. So I don't even really go grocery shopping anymore. I just starve. Or instead of starving, I get Every Plate. Because as you gear up for your busy holidays, you got a budget, right? So if you want those everyday low prices, go with the most affordable of any meal kit out there, and that's Every Plate. Everything's pre-portioned, it's perfect, and they're cheaper than regular groceries, so you have more money for those holiday shopping sprees. And they keep the menu fresh because it rotates. You get more than 25 weekly recipes, including 30 minutes or less, family faves, calorie smart, and veggie dishes. Thanksgiving is coming up pretty soon, so you got some easy sides with Every Plate, like apple pie crescent rolls and sweet potato casserole. Or you know what? Take a break from those rich, heavy holiday foods with their collection of holiday detox recipes. Because, you know, we're all going to stuff our faces Thanksgiving, so might as well stock up on the lighter stuff. So simplify your weeks with hassle-free meals. With Every Plate, you get pre-planned, easy-to-make recipes delivered right to your door. So with affordable dinners for just $5.99 per serving, plus 50% off your first box, Every Plate helps you save money for a stress-free holiday. Get this amazing deal by going to everyplate.com/podcast and entering code LIGHTSOUT599. That's code LIGHTSOUT599 at everyplate.com/podcast. But unfortunately, jailhouse confessions, they just rarely hold up in Texas courtrooms without corroborating evidence. So really, any prisoner can say anything they want, and it really can't be used against them unless if they have evidence that can prove that that's true. So this, along with the conflicting medical examinations that were back and forth, this made prosecutors hold off on charging Clyde with murder for years. Authorities later obtained arrest warrants in 2014 finally, and they finally charged Clyde with murder nearly 40 years after the fact. Tim Miller and several of Heidi Fye's family members attended the trial. So ex-wives and ex-girlfriends accused Clyde of being abusive and violent through the years, and this would all come through in a lot of testimony. He has also been accused of sexually assaulting one of his ex-wife's daughters, known as Marla, after exposing himself to her in a pool. The same ex-wife later pointed out a hole in Clyde's trailer wall that could look into Marla's bedroom. She also once woke up to Clyde touching her chest, and much of this was reported to local police at the time, but nothing was done. Marla also alleged that Clyde would give her Kool-Aid, which might have been drugged. It's insinuated. They don't explicitly ever say this. But she would wake up the next day and apparently her genitalia would feel sore. Marla also recalled one night when Clyde came home covered in blood, holding a bloody knife. According to Marla, Clyde told her mother, quote, "I did it again." Marla later testified at Clyde's trial. She also later claimed she had been to Calder Road back in the 90s. She was there with Clyde when he was contracted to do a mowing job nearby at a friend's property. She claims she witnessed Clyde going out and digging out in the Calder Road fields. Clyde has denied basically every single one of Marla's claims.
Yeah, of course he does.
Of course.
I think Marla has a lot of credibility here, though.
Yeah, I mean, why would she doesn't have much motive to lie about this.
No. And I mean, all this stuff that happened, and there's other ex-wives and ex-girlfriends that can attest to the abuse that Clyde did to them. I think there's enough people here kind of all corroborating the same and telling the same story.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, Clyde is a dangerous, sick, violent predator. It's really bad. It's really bad. But now we have, Marla placing him at the killing fields or the Calder the Calder fields at the very least.
So we know he was working around there. He was even in there at some point.
It is crazy. The one thing that is crazy to me is they told the police this at the time, all this crazy shit that was happening. They did nothing. That's what's wild to me is like, why? It seems like Clyde's just a, pain in the ass for the community. Why not just get him off the street? And why is he allowed to get away with this? Yeah. And that's what's so weird to me.
Mm-hmm. I think Clyde's probably a good liar, and they're just worried about not enough physical evidence against him, is my guess.
Well, let's remember too, Clyde back in the day was kind of a popular individual.
Yep.
At the local bars,
and guy.
And it makes me wonder, kind of going back to that like kind of good old boy attitude. Like, did he have friends at the police department? Possibly. Is he like connected somehow there? I don't know. There's just something weird there.
Yeah.
Like, why is he able to just get away with all this? And I mean, people got away with that shit all the time, especially back in the 70s, 80s.
Right.
I mean, people get away with it today even. So, yeah.
I think it's more possibly just a lack of physical evidence connecting him. But, I mean, it seems like they also just botched the abuse of a corpse case pretty hard.
Yeah.
That's all they could get him on.
Yeah.
But...
well, as the prosecution gathered evidence for Clyde's trial, unfortunately, the medical examiner's office no longer had the file or photographs from the original autopsy of Ellen Beason. It's like, what?
Yeah, what?
Prosecutors still had the correspondence between examiners and the photographs that were taken in later examinations, but not the originals. Just blows my mind. Later, prosecutors met with Dr. Korndorfer, the original county medical examiner, and suddenly he turned over the original files. He's like, oh, oopsie.
Mm-hmm.
I accidentally misplaced them in my personal storage. My bad.
Mm-hmm.
Come on. Fishy. Something is very fishy with Korndorfer. He is covering some stuff up.
What I think is that he's trying to protect his reputation, where it's like, fuck, I didn't deflesh that skull, and I missed a huge piece of evidence that would have connected to, like, this would have been a murder case if I didn't miss that. So he's just trying to cover it up and being like, oop, it's just gone. Sorry.
Yeah. That's why there should be a fucking accountability for these people. Yeah. They should be locked up for 100%. This is such an important job that the fact that there can be this gross negligence without real repercussions is insane to me.
Yeah.
Because this, I mean, we've experienced this on cases we worked with with families, and hearing their experiences with medical examiner's office, it blows my mind the way that they treat families. It's just like no big deal for them when this is literally their loved one's remains, and this is their loved one's murder, and that it's crazy to me. And again, not all. I know there's plenty of competent, good medical examiners out there, but there's definitely definitely some bad ones.
He seemed like a bad seed early on too, because I did find out back in the 70s he was stripped of his medical license for like 5 years, which he tried to appeal. I can't really remember the details of the case. I think it had something to do with like abuse of prescriptions, something along those lines, before he was even a medical examiner. So he already seems a little bit ethically dubious before he was even a medical examiner.
But how did he get his job back? So his license gets reinstated. Like, all right, come on back, man.
Yeah, I don't know.
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
No.
But when prosecutors went through the files, the original skull photographs were not present in the binder where they should have been.
Gone.
Very fishy.
They said everything else was there.
Yeah.
All the other photographs, but all of a sudden they get to the section where it's like her skull, and they were removed. They're gone.
Yeah, and Dr. Korndorfer couldn't explain the missing slides. And he claimed that this was the only time he'd ever taken files back to his home. Does anybody believe that? No, of course not. Only 2 photographs of the skull were submitted as evidence during the trial, and neither showed the fractures. The prosecutor, Kevin Petroff, right?
Yeah.
The prosecutor, Kevin Petroff, then argued that the medical examiner, Dr. Korndorfer, hid or even destroyed the evidence.
That's crazy for a prosecutor to be like, our medical examiner completely not only failed,
Yeah.
but he's might be committing a crime.
Yeah. But of course, he's never held accountable.
Nope.
He's like, all right, well, I'll just retire then.
Yeah.
And that's what he did in 1999. He retired, and he's not even alive anymore. Dr. Korndorfer passed away in April 2016, which it's too late now to get to the bottom of that, figure out what happened there.
And in 1999, so the timeline, I think it was 2006 was Ellen Beason when they were kind of going back and forth about it.
So he was already out of the way at that point.
Yeah.
And that's why they would say something like that in the trial, like go after a former medical examiner. They would never do that to their current existing.
Right.
No,
exactly. We got to self-preserve here.
Yeah. No, it's a great point to bring in here. But because of all of this, although Clyde was initially on trial for murder, he was ultimately only convicted of involuntary manslaughter.
That cannot get this
so
guy.
Sad because had those photographs showing the fractures been there, I think that could have been the piece of evidence that convinced the jury that this was intentional homicide.
Right. And that is the corroborating evidence that they were talking about. They're like, we can't do the prison confession because it doesn't hold up. We need corroborating evidence. And the fact that he said he had taken it, a leg of a table and hit her over the head.
There you go.
That's our corroborating evidence, and it's gone now.
So Clyde only got sentenced to 20 years in prison, which was the maximum sentence, but surprise, surprise, he only ended up serving 8 years in prison. And he was released in October 2021 under mandatory supervision. And as you can imagine, this upset absolutely everybody. Tim Miller protested his release. He was released on the technicality of mandatory release under a law that was in effect during the time of the murder. And then he went on to live in a halfway house.
Released on a technicality.
Yeah.
The worst way to be released.
Absolutely terrible. I mean, they really thought initially that, Clyde's getting up there in age, that with a 20-year sentence, was it 20 or 60 years?
20 for him, yeah.
Okay. They really thought that with that 20-year sentence, they're going to put him away for the rest of his life.
Right.
Most likely. But no, served 8 years and he's out.
Early, yeah.
According to a fellow inmate, while incarcerated, Clyde allegedly confessed to murdering Laura Miller and Heidi Fye.
Good God.
So we'll show you a clip here of Heidi Fye's niece, Nina Edwards, talking about how she actually recognized Clyde.
She lived at the time just a few blocks away from there. I mean, maybe 8 or 9 blocks from the Texas Moon. And I remember I was there with Brandy, Petey's baby, and she was only probably about 3.5 years old. And we were at Petey's house, and he came over. They smoked a joint on the porch, but I took the baby to the inside, and we just stayed inside because I just wanted him to leave. And I told the police that I actually picked his photo out, a binder of people. And I said, that guy came to our house. I didn't even know who he was at the time, but I know I picked his black and white photo out.
So in this case, there was a bit of a question if Heidi Fye knew Clyde before the night of her death. And, according to her niece here, she's confirming that she did, that he had been around the house before.
Right. Yeah. Which is a big detail. So on top of all this, during his trial, prosecutor Kevin Pedroff included an interesting statement in the document, states notice of intent to use evidence of other crimes, wrongs, or acts. In this file, prosecutors mentioned, quote, on September 10th, 1984, the defendant, who was Clyde, had sex with Laura Miller and then intentionally and knowingly killed her. It also said that he, quote, intentionally or knowingly killed Heidi Marie Fye. But Clyde, still to this day, has not been charged with their murders, which make sense. Don't know what's going on. And the DA is like, oh, yeah, I probably shouldn't have done that.
They always backtrack.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the second time that law enforcement has basically released. I mean, this was a court file, but has basically said, like, this is the guy who's done it. We have it. It's right here. Because they did the same thing with Robert Abel with the affidavit. And now we have a court document that's saying also this guy killed these two women as well.
Yeah, and they just put this out too. They didn't even notify the families.
Right.
Because Tim Miller later spotted these statements while just searching through court documents, because he's constantly keeping up with the cases, what's going on in the courts. And he just stumbles across and is like, whoa, what the?
They're saying that he killed my daughter.
So go and arrest him. Go and charge him for these murders. When Tim confronted DA Kevin Petroff, he explained that these statements were based on statements Clyde had allegedly made while incarcerated. And under Texas law, a person cannot be convicted on the basis of jailhouse informants.
So he's saying that, the context of the document was that these were his confessions. But that is not how it was worded in the court document.
No, clearly. So you can imagine how frustrating that is for Tim Miller and the Five family. But here's a clip of DA Kevin Petroff explaining why this information was included in a court file, but why they never charged Clyde with the murders.
Apparently, this episode happened in a communal area in jail. So there were 3 people that overheard this conversation, or Clyde giving this rant. So we had multiple people. Some were just not credible. My name is Kevin Petroff. I'm a former assistant district attorney at the Galveston County District Attorney's Office. Texas law is very suspicious of jailhouse informants, or as they're commonly known, jailhouse snitches. Basically, you cannot make a case based on that. You have to have to have enough corroborative evidence to show that the person charged was actually involved in the murder. One of the things that we do in preparing for trial is we've got to give notice to the defense of just every bad thing we've ever heard about someone. Most of the time, that doesn't come in trial. That's not relevant, but it's something that puts the defense on notice. We did not have, and still don't have, corroborative evidence to support that jailhouse informant story of Clyde in any way being involved in Laura Miller's death.
So I understand everything DA Petroff is talking about, but like, why did you word it that way?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I get what is going on, but you sure made it seem like you're insinuating that you guys know that he killed them.
Right. Which would cause, if I was Tim Miller and I would have read that, I would have been like, what the hell?
Yeah. Some of the other things that he says too are kind of insensitive, in my opinion.
Yeah.
When it comes to dealing with victims and their families, because he kind of is like, well, yeah, the criminal justice system it's hard, it's rough, it's not easy for victims and their families, and he's just kind of nonchalant about it a little bit, and I don't know, he kind of rubs me the wrong way a little bit, but that's just me.
And I also think he does these interviews to cover his tracks. So they can't really put him on blast without him being there to explain himself, because he's also in that Netflix documentary as well.
Right. Well, it was later determined that Clyde was the Millers' previous neighbor in Dickinson, Texas, only 3 houses down.
3 houses.
That's crazy. That's very, in my opinion, that's some circumstantial evidence there.
Yeah, that's not a coincidence.
So he would know, despite Clyde denying he knows Laura Miller, he probably knew of her, probably saw her.
Yeah.
Come on, you're 3 houses down.
Yeah.
According to an old friend, Laura had apparently been afraid of Clyde and would avoid his house when she walked through the neighborhood. She would often walk to the nearby cemetery with her boyfriend Vernon, and Clyde would whistle at her. Clyde had also worked for a contractor on Calder Drive at one point. According to Clyde, of course, he never interacted with Laura. The 2022 Netflix documentary series Crime Scene, The Texas Killing Fields, and, the clips you've just seen are from the KPRC2 true crime docuseries, The Evidence Room, make a case for Clyde being the prime suspect in many of the other Calder Road Field cases. In October of 2021, after the release of Clyde Hedrick, Tim Miller called on local media to hold a press conference Family members of the victims and others who were affected by these cases were given a chance to speak, including Heidi Fye's niece, Nina Edwards, and Marla, the woman who was once abused by Clyde Hedrick. By that time, Clyde had a long criminal record that included trespassing, theft, abuse of a corpse, which we're referring to the Ellen Beason case, attempted arson, possession of marijuana, driving while intoxicated, and of course, sexual assault. He has not been ruled out as a suspect in many of these murder investigations to this day. But here's Tim Miller talking about his frustrations with the case against Clyde Hedrick.
I was hoping that we could go ahead and do a deposition and ask the questions and throw things that we know at him and stuff. So it was another way to go ahead and question Clyde Hedrick on things that we know and stuff, and for him never to respond or anything. And he got very, very ugly with my attorneys when they contacted him. And I'm not patting myself on the back. I'm not going to get rotator cuff surgery tomorrow but you know what? If I wouldn't have done everything I've done over the years, I really feel as though this case would be locked up, closed, nobody'd hear about it again. Nobody had a voice in this thing. I was the only voice. And again, I'm not saying that bragging about it, because it's been a damn difficult, emotional journey, if you want. I was upset with Hedie's dad when he passed away, because it's like, now I'm like the only dad to these damn girls.
I think there's a lot of truth in what he's saying. I agree with him. I think this case would be locked away in a closet somewhere collecting dust. I think they would just move on.
Yeah. And I think, he was saying, if I wasn't on this, where would they have been if we didn't have the local community pressure on these cases? Yeah, it would just be nothing. Really not much has even happened. All we've gotten on this guy was abuse of a corpse, he served 1 year, and then involuntary manslaughter, and he only served 8 years for that. And
there's definitely enough circumstantial evidence, I feel, to potentially have a grand jury look at everything that they have. Again, I think the difficulty is the jurisdiction that this is in, League City. They don't seem very pumped up about even doing this. So I think that's the difficult part of it here. Or they don't feel like they have enough, physical evidence. But again, there's different reasons for which you can convene a grand jury. Investigate. You could do it from an investigative standpoint, just to see, if you have enough to indict. Let the people decide. In my opinion, let the people of this community decide if, and I'm sure there's plenty of people there that are terrified that Clyde is out free. So why not see what you can do? Because I think there's enough here. I mean, you've got Marla now. She's a big piece of this. So yeah, it's really disappointing that it just kind of seems to be left there. I mean, Tim Miller, he went and, filed that civil suit. And in July 2022, he won $24 million in liability and damages after his wrongful death lawsuit, which he filed back in 2014 against Clyde Hedrick. So that's a win, I guess. But again, like
the least they could do, really.
Sure, he'd love to see more.
Yeah.
But Clyde was found civilly liable for Laura's death, but he was still not criminally charged. He's also never been charged for any of the other outstanding Calder Road cases. Tim Miller told reporters, quote, "I filed the wrongful death lawsuit to let Clyde Hedrick know. Clyde, I'm still here. I am still here, and I'm not going to quit until the day I die. I want to let Clyde know that I know what you did to my daughter, and I'm not going to let you rest until we have you where we need to be for the rest of your life." And that's the energy he very much carries every single day to this day.
Yeah. So that's where Clyde's case kind of leaves us. Not much has happened since then.
Which I know too, I just want to clarify, you probably heard Hedrick I think the majority of people pronounce it Hedrick.
Hedrick, yeah.
And that's how we've pronounced it. And then we aren't, and then I think out of respect for her family, and because that's a special thing for them and people who know her personally, we called Heidi instead of Hedie.
Yeah, I explained that at the top. Because, Hedie is people close to her or who knew her family and stuff. So I didn't want to use the family nickname for her. But so moving on from Clyde, what about all these other cases? We still have so many other victims out there. So in 2015, William Reece, if you remember, this was the man convicted of the kidnapping of Sandra Sapow, was linked by DNA to the 1997 cold case murder of Tiffany Johnston in Oklahoma. He was convicted and sentenced to death, and he later confessed to her killings. So I want to point out, we're linked by DNA to this other, unrelated crime, and this shows the power of DNA, which we're losing so much of.
Right. It only works if you preserve it.
Right. Straight up. And convicted and put on death row. That's how severe it was. It wasn't like all these wishy-washy abuse of a corpse, involuntary manslaughter. We got his DNA connected to this case. It's a done deal. While on death row, he made a deal with law enforcement, and he confessed to 3 more murders and agreed to reveal the location of the remains of Jessica Cain and Kelli Ann Cox. If you remember, these were the young women who disappeared from the I-45 area in 1997 in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He claimed that on July 15th, 1997, he was driving from Oklahoma to Houston, where he stopped to buy some whiskey at a gas station in Denton, where he spotted Kelli. He claimed that he got into a physical confrontation with her and strangled her in a fight. He denied any sexual assault. In 2016, he led authorities to her remains buried in the woods in Brazoria County. Tim Miller and EquiSearch assisted in the excavation of the remains. So as for Jessica Cain, the other victim, William claimed he had approached her outside of the restaurant she was at with friends, but she rejected him. He then tailed her vehicle until she stopped to confront him. He admitted that he beat her and strangled her to death, but again, denied any sexual assault. He led authorities to Jessica's remains in a field off of East Orem Road next to Hobby Airport in Houston. On top of all this, William Reece also confessed to the killing of Laura Smither, not to be confused with Laura Miller. Laura Smither was the 12-year-old who had gone missing after going for a jog in Friendswood. He admitted that on April 3rd, 1997, the day Laura had gone on a jog, he had accidentally hit her with his car, but then later revised his statement.
Yeah, let's hear the truth, man.
Confessing that he did, in fact, strangle her to death. Here is Laura Smither's mother, Gay, talking about William Reece and the concept of forgiveness and what it kind of means to her.
He did not have to lead law enforcement to Jessica and Kelli's remains. Those girls could still be among the missing. So I wanted to thank him for doing the right thing finally. We all make mistakes. Yes, his are beyond mistakes, but that's what he did in the end was the right thing. And so it was important for me to say thank you to him for that and to let him know that I did forgive him. I was in such a prison of anger before I came to forgiveness. Forgiveness is very misunderstood. Forgiveness was really for me to let myself out of I was in such a prison of anger and rage about what had happened to our family. And through the sacrament of reconciliation, I came to that place, and I'm so grateful because I was literally eating myself from the inside out with cancer. And that allowed me to move forward. So I'm here today because of that.
Oh, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah. And she does explain forgiveness in a way where it's like, this is for me to heal. This isn't necessarily letting this guy off the leash or anything. This is something internal that I'm dealing with. People do argue about whether he did it just out of,
Well, he did get off death row.
Yeah. As far as I understand, it's still like a gray area of where he is, because some reports I was reading that he was still on death row.
Just not.
Maybe they're just
they don't have execution or something.
Yeah. So I couldn't really figure that one out. But also people point that out to be like, he was doing it so he wouldn't die. But then others argue, like obviously his defense attorney was like, no, he wanted to get this off his chest. So I guess we don't really know the truth.
Yeah, and Bill's kind of a smooth talker too. He's very good at kind of like manipulating and making you feel, maybe feel bad for him in a way.
Right.
And like, oh,
right.
He talks the talk for sure.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, this is a disturbing conversation that Tim Miller later had with William. And Tim basically asked William, he got a chance to speak with him. He asked if he had any remorse. According to Tim, this is what William responded with. Quote, "You'll never understand this, but people like me, we don't have remorse." So a little bit of a conflicting story, if he's doing this out of the goodness of his heart, because if he's saying he doesn't have any remorse, then that's a bit confusing. But either way, William was later convicted and sentenced to life for each of the 3 murders that he confessed to. As for the Jane and Janet Doe found in the Calder Road fields, there was Heidi Fye, there was Laura Miller, then there was Jane Doe, and there was Janet Doe. Those were the original 4 in the Calder Road fields. The Jane and Janet Doe hadn't been identified in over 30 years. And like we had said before, they tried to use clay models and sketches to try to identify them, but still no one had come forward and no one could identify them. But a newer technique, which is genetics genealogy tests, were then conducted in 2017 in an attempt to identify these 2 victims. FBI agents claimed it was difficult to convince League City Police that the genealogy tests were worth it. And it took the FBI a year and a half to finally convince League City Police to run these tests. As it would later turn out, the tests would absolutely be
science.
Worth it. Yeah.
You want us to use science to try to solve these cases?
No, you want to keep using clay models? God.
I'm sorry. I know I'm ripping on League City Police.
Yeah,
but
it's hard not to feel really frustrated with this case, though, with these cases.
You just think that if they had all these unsolved cases, they would be desperate to try anything that could work.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're still, all these years later, so resistant to any sort of progress.
Just going to keep looking like buffoons.
Yeah, it's like, why?
Why?
What are you guys hiding? What are you guys protecting over there?
Right.
It's hard not to start thinking that way when they're doing this shit.
I agree.
And
like you could argue, it's just a budgetary constraint thing. But I'm like, at this point, the spotlight is so on you guys right now. You should have in a heartbeat. The FBI is coming to us with like genealogy data. Immediately jump on that. I don't get why they have to twist their arm over a year and a half about it. Both tests took an hour or less, and after 30 plus years, in April 2019, both women were successfully identified through family tree DNA. Here's a short news clip about basically explaining these genealogy tests.
In murder cases that, as you mentioned, stretch back nearly 4 decades, League City Police have announced that they have identified Jane and Janet Doe. These are 2 victims from the so-called Killing Fields murders. They had been working on identifying these victims naturally the entire time, but that work really started to gain steam last year when League City Police partnered with the DNA technology company in Virginia called Paragon Nanolabs. From that work, the lab was able to do something called DNA phenotyping in very overly simplified way. That's taking somebody's DNA and making predictions about hair color, eye color, skin type, and look. From that, they were able to come up with these digital sketches of what these 2 young ladies look like. Now, police say through even more advanced genealogical research, they have positively identified Jane and Janet Doe. However, police say they are holding off announcing those names until Monday because they want to give people who are out of town the chance to get to League City when they make the announcement of the identities of these 2 women.
Pretty incredible how they did that.
Yeah, it's always amazing to me how effective it is.
Yeah,
and quickly, they can identify people from their DNA.
That's awesome. So after all this time, they finally identified these two women. Janet Doe turned out to be 34-year-old Donna Prudhomme from Port Arthur, Texas. Donna had allegedly moved to the Houston area for work like many other people did. She loved to play board games, listen to music like ZZ Top and Janis Joplin, and she also really loved fishing. She was very close with her sister Diane. She was also a mother at the time of her disappearance. I believe she had 2 children. Her family was aware of her substance abuse problems when she went missing, but Diane continued searching for her. So against the common mainstream narrative that police tried to push, where it was like these people were runaways, that no one was looking for them, they didn't care, whatever, goes directly against it. Diane, her sister, was continuously looking for her. And yeah, okay, we know she has a drug abuse problem. Still, her sister, this is a loved one, and still these people are looking for them. So by 2008, this was many years after she had gone missing, Diane had continued her search and reached out to a local investigative journalist, Don Dodd from the Examiner, to see if he could find anything, because obviously all the attempts to get police on this case were exhausted. So she tried to go for a journalist. Unfortunately, he came up with nothing at the time. And Diane, as she would explain it, for the sake of her own mental health, she just had to accept that her sister was dead. That was in 2008. And she said her biggest regret was allowing her children to see how much she had grieved the loss of her sister. 11 years after this, she was notified by League City Police that they had finally identified Donna as the Janet Doe in the Calder Road field. Although tragic, Diane did express that she was at least thankful she knew Donna didn't simply walk out on her children. She added, quote, "I've looked for her with detectives and everything, and to find out that she was just right here all this time, it's really a lot of peace and a lot of healing for our entire family." So I think that's another good point to raise, that she was a victim and we don't even have anyone charged, and we don't really have a solid suspect for this case. But even these things like the genealogy tests and stuff like that can still bring some level of peace to these family members, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Diane also later found out that Donna's remains had not been properly preserved, and her fingernails had been clipped, but the clippings were lost. In an odd incident, the Galveston County Medical Examiner, which we know who that is, had also issued 5 different death certificates, which makes no sense. This later had to be amended down to 1, where it confirmed she had died from a homicide.
So they keep changing it, reissuing it.
Yeah. Today, Diane believes Clyde Hedrick is the suspect, and reportedly, Donna's son remembers Clyde hanging around his mother during his childhood in Louisiana. Unfortunately, Donna's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance passed away only a few months before she was identified, so law enforcement never had the opportunity to interview him. Her case is still open to this day. So one suspect, Mark Roland Stallings, who is serving currently 2 life sentences for unrelated crimes, he told author Catherine Casey that he killed Janet Doe, who was Donna Prudhomme, in 1991. He even described the crime in graphic detail. Catherine later published a book titled Deliver Us, covering the Texas killing fields, and Catherine also took his admission to a forensic pathologist who said it was, quote, highly possible that Donna died in the same manner that Stallings described. He had also lived in League City near the home of many of the girls who had been murdered, and allegedly he confessed while incarcerated to murdering Donna. He still hasn't been charged, but in 2021 he remained a suspect in the murders of Donna Prudhomme and Audrey Cook. So that's Janet Doe. As for Jane Doe, she was identified as 30-year-old Audrey Lee Cook from Memphis, who worked as a mechanic for a golf cart company in Houston, Harrison Equipment Company in Houston, and Balloon Affair in Houston. She loved fishing with her father and riding her dirt bike. She also moved to the area for work. It also turned out that her family had been looking for her for years, and her mother knew something was really wrong when Audrey never called her on Christmas 1985. Her last known contact with family was December 17th, 1985. Her mother had sent a letter to Audrey's last known address, but the letter was returned by the post office. Family members, especially her sister-in-law, tried searching for her for years. They had come up with nothing. And unfortunately, by the time she was identified, both her mother, father, and brother had already passed away.
Yeah, that's extremely sad.
Yeah.
Knowing that they never knew what happened to her.
Right.
At the end of the day, but I think this goes to show just how important DNA analysis really is, and genealogy. I mean, it's such a tool.
Huge.
That as time goes forward, I think we'll see that used far more, and I think it's going to help solve a lot more of these cold cases
For sure.
But among all of these cases in the Texas killing fields, many men have been suspected of murder. Some have been charged, but here are several more suspects and convicted murderers connected to different cases in the area. In 1998, a man named Edward Harold Bell, a convicted murderer serving 70 years for killing a Marine and then fleeing to Panama before being extradited, told prosecutors he had also killed 11 girls in the 1970s. Harold said he couldn't remember all the names of his victims, but they included a number of those whose bodies were found in the I-45 area. Some of his victims are believed to have been Colette Wilson, Debbie Ackerman, Maria Johnson, Kimberly Pitchford, Rhonda Johnson, and Sharon Shaw, but police couldn't connect him to any evidence connected to these crimes. He remained a prime suspect, but was never charged for any of the Texas killing fields murders. And he's not even alive anymore. He actually died in prison in 2019. In April 2012, Kevin Edison Smith was arrested for the murder of 13-year-old Crystal Jean Baker. This was 16 years after her body was discovered in March 1996. She had been beaten, raped, and strangled. Kevin Smith was identified as the killer when an officer submitted Crystal Baker's dress for DNA analysis.
DNA.
So there you go. The DNA came back and matched Kevin Smith, who had been arrested for a minor drug offense in 2010. He was later convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. In 1987, 30-year-old John Robert King contacted the El Paso police, where he confessed to killing 19-year-old Shelley Sykes while she was in her car. She was last seen leaving her job as a waitress on the beachfront in Galveston, Texas, just before 12 a.m. on May 24, 1986. John told police he carried out the rape and murder with the help of a man named Gerald Peter Zwarst. Both men were arrested, and Gerald told police where he had hidden the body, but unfortunately, Shelley Sykes has never been found. Both men were convicted of aggravated kidnapping and were sentenced to life imprisonment in 1998. They were also questioned about their involvement in other killings, but both have denied having any involvement. Both have since died in prison as well. John King back in October 2015, and Gerald Zwarst in November 2020. In 1972, convicted sex offender Michael Lloyd Self became a suspect in the murders of Rhonda Johnson and Sharon Shaw. He confessed after hours of interrogation, but later retracted his confession, alleging he had been tortured into admitting to the murders by the police chief, Don Morris. In September 1974, he was convicted of killing Sharon Shaw and was sentenced to life in prison despite the credibility of his confession. 3 years later, police chief Don Morris and his deputy, Tommy Deal, were arrested and convicted of numerous crimes themselves, including torture and misconduct against detainees. Still, Michael's attempts at an appeal failed, and he ended up dying on December 21st, 2000. And 16 years later, a number of police officials reportedly admitted their belief that he had been wrongfully convicted. Oof, just wild. This is just so messy.
Yeah.
And in recent years, many have brought attention to a victim known as, quote, the forgotten victim of the Texas killing fields. A 33-year-old newlywed, Cheryl Martin, had been discovered in a drainage ditch under a Leak City Bridge on November 3, 1989. In recent news, detectives believe they may have found the murder weapon used to strangle Cheryl, and her case is still unsolved, but DNA evidence might be able to push her case forward. But while some families have gotten answers, many have been left in the dark. Others are hoping that prime suspects like Clyde Hedrick will finally be brought to justice. Tim Miller said, quote, as time goes by, and the more information I get, and the more information I'm continuing to get, I have no doubt in my mind Clyde Hedrick is responsible for Laura's murder. Clyde's whereabouts today are unknown. But just last year, a 4th anniversary gathering was held to remember the victims of the Calder Road field killings.
Shining a light, fighting for justice. The families of 4 girls who were murdered decades ago still looking for closure, hosting a vigil at the place where their bodies were found, dubbed the Killing Fields off I-45 in Galveston County.
We just want to pick up the pieces, move ahead, one day have...
40 years ago on October 7 was the last time Hedie Villarreal Fry was seen alive by family. She's one of the 4 who were found here.
40 years, I'm looking at my family and what we've gone through, decades of missing her.
Her niece, Nina Jager, has taken it upon herself to continue the fight for justice that her grandfather, Hedie's father, started 4 decades ago.
And I think it's just important that nobody forgets what happened to these girls out here.
Months after Hedie was found, Tim Miller's 16-year-old daughter, Laura, disappeared. Her body was discovered here 17 months later.
A lot of emotions, a lot of memories over the last 40 years.
Miller is the founder of Texas EquiSearch. The disappearance of his daughter was what prompted him to start helping families find their loved ones. The other 2 girls, Audrey Cook and Donna Prudhomme, were not identified until 2019.
The anger that's inside because of what has happened and why we can't get that justice. And
these families not giving up the fight.
As long as I'm still breathing and able, I'm not going to stop.
Continuing to be the voice to those who were left voiceless decades ago.
we want to be able to put our lives back together someday.
But today, the FBI and local law enforcement are still working on open cases related to the murders and disappearances of primarily young women along the I-45 Houston and Galveston, Texas area. And very few have been solved to this day. But the FBI says they're on it. It seems like there's more of a task force now. It's definitely still a long way to go, I think, just because there's not that much evidence to go off of. But before we wrap things up, I want to just kind of gather my thoughts here and just kind of think about this whole thing, because I think it's pretty obvious at this point that there's multiple killers responsible for all of these murders, all 30 plus of them.
Agreed.
I don't think Clyde did all of them. Did he do a number of them? It seems very possible.
Yeah.
Especially the Calder Road killings. I think those seem to be the most likely for him.
Yeah.
Because of the time period, the location, the distance between the bodies.
Knowing that he was living around there, he was working around there.
But it just seems like it's this area, this stretch of highway where you have a lot of transients coming through there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of killers that are truck drivers that are driving through this area that are, stopping, and based on even William Reece's accounts of how he killed his victims, it seems like a lot of these killers are just operating off of, they see an opportunity and they take it.
Yeah.
And then they quickly dispose of the body and then move on.
Right. And not even transients. Well, because we know that a lot of
some of them are just families, working there or have families. Yeah.
Right. Some are, out of towners who maybe didn't have family there. But then, we've seen plenty of these cases that they were there. They were young and they had families and and they were still just lost to this void where, I don't know, maybe it's a combination of like these killers get away with it. And if you get away with one and you notice that there's just dead silence out there and police aren't even paying attention to it because they've written it off as a runaway, why not try it again? And why not dump them in the same spot I did before, right? It just kind of opens up a gateway for people to abuse this area, knowing that local police weren't really focusing on it through the whole, basically almost the whole 70s and then into the 80s. So I could see it just predatory murderers catching on to this area and just getting away with it.
Well, and again, especially kind of in the prime time that all this was happening, 70s, 80s, this area was like booming with, the oil boom and everything. So there's a lot of influx of people coming in, the types of jobs that were being filled, potentially some of the people getting those jobs, like with, going back to William, he had his criminal record and it's a lot of these manual labor jobs, blue collar jobs, things like that. So it could have attracted more of those types of people into the area during this period of time. Cause it's like,
not to say that killers are all blue collar workers, but you could see like if you're going to move across the country and pick up some work, this was the area to do it. Right.
It just sheer amount of people coming in to this area when this area prior had been more, more rural, less people. I think there's part of that. There's some theories out there, which I find interesting, around potentially could there be somebody within the League City Police Department, because we know with other serial killers that had been police officers at one time, could there be somebody from that period of time who worked for the League City Police Department
covering
his tracks, pointing them to other people? I think that's an interesting theory, and maybe it helps kind of explain some of the resistance.
Yeah, I was going to say it would make sense. It would make more sense if it wasn't just gross incompetence, that it would actually be someone from within, right? Then you can explain that.
Like, no wonder they weren't trying that hard.
Right, yeah, because I think maybe our bigger fear is that it is just gross incompetence, that it's just people shrugging it off and not doing anything about it and completely messing up these cases. It's almost like, in a very sick and twisted way, it would almost be a bit more understandable if it was just someone within law enforcement that was like actively covering this up, rather than swallowing the pill of like, no, these people are kind of idiotic.
But I think we both know the more likely reality is this was just idiotic incompetence.
Yeah.
Like, they just, for whatever reason, just did not care about these women whatsoever.
Yeah.
Did not see them as worthy of finding out what happened to them, and it's so sad. I mean, it still happens today. It's just
and like losing evidence, it's hard for me to wrap my head around, and especially with Korndorfer, I think there was a bit of like covering his tracks going on there, manipulating some of the evidence, removing the slides. Again, as far as I know, that's never been proven, but the DA was willing to accuse him of that, which I think is fairly damning.
Yeah.
I just I don't think have we ever covered a case on here where a medical examiner was like removing evidence or destroying evidence?
No, not on this show, but I have on other,
have you?
Other shows and projects.
So I think this is personally, that's the first time I've ever seen something like that happening, which is disgusting.
It's disgusting, but it definitely happens. I mean, it's crazy across this country how often evidence disappears or somehow bodies decompose further, that you think that they're keeping them in freezers, and then you get the body back and it's just a bunch of bones. You know what I mean? It's just such a broken system, and there's too much politics involved too. There's too many egos wrapped up in these positions of DA and medical examiner, and especially in these smaller towns, from experience, have seen, they just kind of get in these positions and they'll do anything to defend it and anything to kind of keep the reputation going, even when mistakes are being made and nobody holds them accountable. And I think that's a lot what's happening in the Texas killing fields. And based on listening to Tim Miller and his thoughts, I mean, it seems like
I was just about to bring
he's
him
just
up
like
too,
he has no faith in them whatsoever. And they failed him over and over and over again over the years, and he had to do everything.
He just took it into his own hands.
An amazing individual, by the way. And all the, victims' families in these cases are absolutely amazing and inspiring to see.
And the fact that there are still a bunch of family members advocating for these cases, and
they're keeping it alive.
Which is
it's not
really
the
important.
police.
No,
League City Police hopes this all goes away. They move on and nobody brings up the Texas killing fields ever again, or the Calder Road cases.
And I wonder if that's why maybe they didn't want to do the genealogy to identify the victims, because they were like, no, can't we just put this to bed already?
They want to move on and try to sweep it under and
live in disgrace.
But how could you ever expect that from a family? And that's what I never get, is like, aren't these people got families too? What if this was your kid?
Exactly.
Your daughter that was murdered, and you went to the police and they're like, she ran away. Like, how would you feel?
Right.
And that's where, there's clearly some empathy missing from the equation.
And that's what Diane breaks my heart, because she was saying, like, my biggest regret is allowing my children to see how much I've grieved. Like, that's so horrific. I mean, for her to admit that is like really powerful, but I also think, man, like, this wasn't just somebody forgotten. This wasn't just, a vagrant who lives whatever lifestyle, like how the media and how the police want to portray these victims to make it maybe, easier, I'm saying it in air quotes, for us to kind of move on as a community. It's just a false narrative. I don't know. It's hard for just people to be forgotten. Everybody has, a mom. Everyone has a father.
Yeah.
There are family
Sister,
connections. There are even
daughter,
friends.
yeah.
Like I don't know. I don't like the idea of writing people off because they're whatever. They'll be forgotten easier. We have this like tier list of people. I hate that idea so much.
Yeah, from a philosophical point of view, I don't even know where that came from.
Yeah.
Why that's even a thing. Just seems like, yeah, I think it's a product of our system.
Yeah. And like allocating resources
Right.
and trying to look good in the public spotlight. Well, if spotlight does
Right.
come on us, we allocate our resources there rather than
If it's
just
a good
treat
kid.
everything. Yeah.
Good
quote unquote.
kid, good family,
Mhm.
we'll look extra hard for them. But if it's somebody who's living alternatively or, doing something against the societal norms, then, we're not going to dedicate as much resources to them. And that happens all the time today. I mean, it's just, it's sad. I wish it would change, and I wish there was something we could do about it. I mean, what these cases really show you is that you've got to be your own advocate for your family member.
Absolutely.
And your missing loved one. You've got to do your own research, do your own investigation.
Yeah, it's cases like this that make me realize like, this is why we have PIs. Like,
Absolutely.
this is why they're out there.
Yeah.
It's
Which
cases like
sucks
this.
that, you have to then go spend, already pay taxes
Right, yeah.
to these, local law enforcement agencies. And then when something happens to you,
Actually
they're not always helping.
Yeah.
They're not always doing everything they can possibly do. And you got to fight tooth and nail with them just to get them to do something.
Yeah.
And again, not the case every single time. There's plenty of cases where they're on top of it. There's lots of great departments out there, but it just seems like
in this specific instance.
Yeah, in this specific instance, absolutely not. I mean, they failed their community big time. Failed the families who lost loved ones. I mean, I think the other takeaway from cases like this too is just like looking at who these people are, the suspects, and why they do these things and how they do them. And I think that it's just, the longer I do true crime, the more paranoid I get about my own, I have a daughter, and, it freaks me out thinking about her ever roaming around out in public by herself. And just knowing the sheer amount of predators that are out there scares the hell out of me.
Yeah.
And, from my perspective, the only thing I can do is educate and inform my child about the realities of the world and how to be safe. And, here's the tools and things that you can do to be, buddy systems. But it reminds you just how unsafe it really is. And that you, especially as a woman, you have to be so careful.
Yes. Even as a grown-ass man, I still take into account buddy system.
Yeah,
I think that
same.
was like instilled in me also in Boy Scouts. It was always instilled in me.
Yeah,
and
same.
so I still like, if I just go anywhere, do anything, like anywhere, I'm like, I'd rather do it with somebody else just for that sense of security. Maybe.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, we're all susceptible to violent crime.
Right.
I think talking purely from a sexual assault point of view. I think,
the stats
women
are
are
different.
Are clearly, there's, more of that going on. It's just, but with all that being said, definitely want to know your thoughts and opinions out there. Is there some other suspects that maybe we didn't cover that, think could be potentially responsible for, especially, the Calder Road murder cases? Be interested to hear what your thoughts are on this, and especially from those of you who live in this area or live in Houston. Have you heard about this case before? Do you still hear about it? We definitely want to know. But I think we want to end this episode. I found a video is actually posted by the FBI. I think it was very well done because it's got Tim Miller in it. It's also got some other family members just talking about how they never give up hope that they'll bring whoever's responsible behind these murders to justice, and also the FBI agent that's really been heading up this the FBI's work on these cases over the years. We'll leave you with that, and of course, we always want to keep victims of this case and her thoughts.
Yeah, and if you guys want to check out EquiSearch, which is Tim Miller's organization, we can drop a link.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Which, if anybody out there works for EquiSearch or knows somebody over at EquiSearch, I'd love to make contact with them and see how how our Higher Hope Foundation could definitely help out.
Yeah.
With operations over there. I'd love to get involved with EquiSearch. I think they're doing some really amazing work that's much needed. So, but yeah, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's episode there. We'll see you guys next time.
This case is known as the Calder Road Killings or the Killing Fields. There were 4 victims found throughout the years. The fact that the offender chose this area gives us a couple little tidbits of insight. It's such a remote, rural area. Somebody had to know about that place. What we're looking for is some anomalies that exist between all 4 girls. If there's one person that knew all the girls, or one person that was seen with the girls, that of course would be a great lead for us. But anything that anybody in the public knows, anything, no matter how small they think it is, we really want them to come forward, because it may be very significant to us, even though they think it's just a small tidbit that doesn't have any meaning.
Yeah, I think about Laura every day. I miss her. And it's always going to be that empty plate at the dinner table. But, her death wasn't in vain. It wasn't in vain. I'm not going to say it still isn't difficult. I would go out there where Laura's body was found. And, I would walk up to her cross. I put my hand on her cross and I say, Laura, please don't hate your daddy, but I can't come out here anymore. I have to say goodbye, and I have to put my life back together. And I'd literally be walking away and I hear this little voice say, Dad, don't quit, please don't quit. I'm going to fight to my dying breath to do what I can do to make sure whoever murdered Laura and the other girls, justice is served.
The fact it hasn't been solved doesn't mean it's not being worked, and doesn't mean it's not being worked diligently. It just means that we're not getting the breaks that we need at this point. We need to go further and find the killer and bring him to justice. And I think that would heal a lot of wounds in the community.
I was at work and one of the girls said, Miss Diane, your phone is going off. And when I went and looked at it, I had 2 calls from my cousin and then a text that said, call ASAP. And when I called her, she said, where are you? I said, I'm at work. She said, go outside. I said, okay, I'm outside. And she said, Diane, I just got off the phone with the Detective Tisdale from the League City Police Department. And I knew, my knees fell out. Gina started to tell me they found her. I don't want to know. I didn't want to know any of it. I just was relieved I was relieved. She had a pretty tough life. She loved to shrimp and crab and fish on the banks of the Sabine River. She loved her children so much. The bottom line to all this is no one deserves to die like she did. No one.
It's very important for the public to know that we have not given up. You know, it may be labeled a cold case. That doesn't mean it's just sitting on a shelf not being worked. It's being worked actively at FBI. It's being actively worked at League City Police Department, and we have other resources from other agencies that are helping out. I want everybody to know that nobody has given up on this case. And I want the offender to know, if he's watching, that we will come get you.